Oh, stumbling upon this hidden refuge is no accident. Perhaps the Emperor himself guided your steps here. Follow me, sit beside the fire, and take some rest. There's a long road ahead of you among the stars, so feel free to ease your mind and listen to my tales. Tonight, we travel far into the past, to a broken and poisoned earth, drowning in the long dark of the Age of Strife. It is a time before the Imperium, before the Great Crusade, before the golden light of the Astronomicon ever pierced the void. It is the story of a single golden figure who rose from the ashes of a dying world, and the terrible wars he waged to bind a fractured Terra into one. This is the story of unity. Our tale begins in the late 29th millennium, in a span of years so distant that even the wisest scholars of the later Imperium could only guess at their shape. By this time, nearly 300 Terran centuries had passed since humanity first left the polluted, used-up carcass of the world it called Earth, reaching outward for the bounties and the perils that waited among the stars. In those early ages of exploration, mankind had spread far, seeding colonies across countless worlds and stitching them together with ships that crossed the gulfs between suns. For a while, the species had thrived, and the birth world had ruled over all of it as a shining capital, the mother of 1,000 younger worlds. Yet all of that had crumbled. The colonies were severed one by one, cut off from the Sol system and from each other, until the old bonds of trade and travel withered and snapped. The Sol system itself, the very cradle of the human race, slid backward into an age of barbarism. Cut off from its distant children, it turned inward, and there was no world within that system that had fallen further than Terra, the planet that had once been the proud capital of humanity, the birthplace of mankind and the seat of its highest civilization, now lay in ruin, its glory buried beneath centuries of decay and slaughter. Across the surface of Terra, madness had taken hold, where once the vast hive cities had risen as shining beacons of light, towering monuments to human achievement. They had degraded into squalid pits of pain and misery. Their upper reaches crumbled, their lower depths choked with the desperate and the dying. The great works of the past had been lost and forgotten, or shattered outright in the ceaseless wars fought over whatever scraps of technology still functioned. A man who could repair an old machine held more power than a man who could win a battle, for the knowledge of how such devices worked had slipped almost entirely out of human hands. The land itself was poisoned. Ancient wars had scarred the crust of the world with craters and wastes, and the seas had drawn back from shorelines that were now bleached and lifeless. Rivers of filth wound through the ruins of cities whose names had been forgotten. Ash drifted down from skies, stained by centuries of industry and fire, and the wind that moved across the broken plains carried the grit of pulverized stone and the stench of rot. Whole regions lay empty of anything that might be called life, given over to dust and silence. In the places where people still clung to survival, they gathered under the rule of tyrants and warlords, cult leaders and petty kings. Global communication had failed long ago, so that one region knew almost nothing of another, and the scattered domains of Terra warred among themselves in endless, grinding conflict. Some of these domains were techno-feudal empires, ruled by dynasties that hoarded the last working relics of the old age and used them as tools of conquest. Others were bound together by superstition and blood-soaked religion, their people herded into obedience by fear of gods both false and terrible. Every one of them fought the others, and the fighting never truly stopped. The men who waged these wars were the techno-barbarians, warriors who had no true understanding of the sciences their weapons drew upon. They wielded the products of a lost age without grasping how those products functioned, treating fusion cannons and atomic fire as though they were the gifts of gods or the curses of demons. What they understood was violence, and in violence they were terribly practiced. They warred without end for the last scraps of forgotten technology from mankind's glorious past. For a single functioning generator or a cache of ancient blades could raise a warlord above his rivals and make him master of 100 miles of ruin. Generation after generation was born into this darkness, lived amid its cruelty, and died without ever knowing that the stars above had once belonged to their kind. The story of humanity's greatness had faded into myth, and even the myths had grown twisted and strange. To be born on Terra in these years was to know hunger and fear and the constant nearness of death, and to believe that this was simply the shape of the world, the way it had always been and always would be. This was the state of the birth world as the 29th millennium drew toward its close. A poisoned planet, splintered into countless warring realms, its people sunk into ignorance, and its cities collapsing into dust. And yet, even in the deepest of this darkness, a change was beginning to stir, far beyond the surface of Terra, out in the seething and unquiet ocean of the warp that lay beneath the skin of reality. For the storms that had cut Terra off from the stars were about to shift, and their shifting would open a door that had long been shut. For thousands of standard years, the dimension of psychic energy known as the immaterium churned in a continuous violent upheaval around the Sol system. Thick bands of kinetic radiation and multicolored plasma formed a physical barrier between Terra and the rest of the galaxy. Ships, attempting to traverse this barrier, fractured under immense gravity tides, their adamantium hulls shearing into jagged splinters before dissolving into base atoms. Deep inside the subterranean bunkers of Terra, the astropaths, humans mutated to send psychic messages across the stars, suffered massive physical trauma whenever they reached out with their minds. Blood poured from their eyes and ears, and their vocal cords snapped as they expelled the screeching acoustic feedback of the warp. The orbital launch silos sat filled with drifting ash, and the massive colony vessels rusted into mountains of orange flakes upon the launch pads. Far across the galaxy, near the dense core of the ancient Eldari civilization, a massive concentration of psychic energy reached critical mass. Trillions of Eldari pushed their nervous systems to the point of biological rupture, shedding bodily fluids and shattering bones in extreme sensory indulgence. This continuous release of bioelectric and psychic energy funneled the turbulence of the warp toward a single galactic coordinate. As the raw matter of the immaterium compressed into that distant epicenter, preparing to birth the entity known as Slanesh, the surrounding regions of the galaxy experienced a sudden, violent drop in atmospheric and psychic pressure. Around the Sol system, the dense walls of kinetic radiation thinned out. The churning vortexes of magenta and violet energy flattened into placid, traversable currents. The blood dried upon the cheeks of the astropaths, and the static hum vibrating through the deep earth bunkers was replaced by the slow, echoing dripping of condensation. Down on the surface of Terra, the physical evidence of the long isolation covered every landmass. Massive carbon fiber tether cables, once stretching into orbit, lay snapped and tangled over the collapsed domes of the hive cities. Spaceports the size of continents held the skeletal remains of transport shuttles, their thruster bells packed solid with centuries of blown sand and grey ash. Giant communication arrays pointed blindly at the heavy smog layer above, their dish surfaces pockmarked by acid rain, and their power conduits stripped bare to the copper wiring by scavengers. Rivers of toxic sludge carved deep channels through the bedrock, giving off the sharp scent of sulfur and oxidized iron. Within the shadows of these dead spaceports and shattered hives, the warriors known as the techno-barbarians slaughtered one another to claim territory. They modified their flesh with scavenged machinery, bolting rusted iron plating directly into their shoulder blades and collarbones. They replaced severed limbs with heavy hydraulic claws that trailed exposed, sparking cables. They carried heavy fusion cannons, plasma projectors, and volkite rifles scavenged from deep subterranean vaults, gripping the sophisticated weapons with hands stained in grease and dried blood. They draped their broad shoulders in the irradiated pelts of mutated hounds and wore necklaces strung with human teeth and finger bones. These warriors worshipped the advanced machinery of the past with ritual sacrifice. They smeared engine oil across their foreheads and poured freshly drawn human blood over the cooling vents of their plasma weapons, reciting guttural chants and striking the metal casings with heavy wrenches. When a fusion battery depleted, they hurled it into the mud and abandoned it, leaving the highly advanced power cells to sink into the filth. Armies of these modified killers marched across the salt flats of dried oceans, their heavy boots grinding the bones of previous generations into a fine white powder. They fought endlessly over the possession of a functioning water purifier, a cache of sealed nutrient paste, or a fortified bunker built with thick lead walls. The heavy thud of crude artillery shells echoed across the ash dunes, followed by the crackling roar of atomic fire that left plains of green, radioactive glass in its wake. Plumes of black smoke choked the horizon as warlords unleashed genetically altered monstrosities, hulking brutes with chemically swelled muscles and grafted armor, to tear apart opposing infantry lines. The smell of burning promethium and roasted flesh hung permanently in the air. Warlords sat upon thrones built from crushed tank treads and severed hydraulic arms, watching their followers butcher rival clans for the right to hold a glowing plasma pistol. Deep beneath the towering, snow-capped peaks of the Himalayan mountains, vast geothermal generators hummed with steady, continuous power. Arc lights illuminated sterile, metallic corridors lined with heavy gene forges and biological incubation vats. The scent of ozone and sterilized amniotic fluid filled the air, circulating through massive brass ventilation grills. Inside the central observation chamber, a single man stood before a towering wall of chronotors and astropathic augurs. He stood taller and broader than any mortal human, clad in heavy gold armor that caught the glare of the arc lights. He watched the brass dials on the augurs spin downward into the green zones, registering the clearing of the galactic pathways and the stabilization of the warp currents. He looked at the incubating super soldiers floating within the amber fluid of the vats around him, their massive frames twitching as the nutrient feeds pumped into their spinal columns. He ran a gauntleted hand over the hilt of a massive sword sheathed at his hip. He turned his gaze away from the auger screens and faced the heavy adamantium doors that led to the surface, preparing to march out into the ash and the blood of the poisoned world above. 10,000 standard years before the first metal hives covered the surface of Terra, human tribes built settlements of mud brick and timber along the fertile river valleys of the planet. Men and women, clothed in animal hides and woven plant fibers, hunted wild beasts with flint-tipped spears and gathered wild grains in woven baskets. As the seasons passed, these early humans discovered how to smelt copper and tin, hammering the metals into axes and broad-bladed swords. Among these early humans lived men and women who possessed the first physical manifestations of psychic ability. The tribes called them shamans. These individuals coated their skin in white ash and red ochre, sitting inside dark caves illuminated by small, sputtering, fat-burning lamps. They inhaled the thick smoke of dried herbs to enter deep biological trances, slowing their heart rates and expanding their minds into the parallel dimension of the immaterium. In those ancient days, the immaterium flowed as a placid ocean of silver and blue energy. When a shaman's physical body reached the end of its biological lifespan, their heart would stop beating, and their concentrated psychic energy would slip into the currents of the warp. The soul would drift through the calm tides of the Empyrean before anchoring itself to the developing nervous system of a newborn infant in the physical realm. The shaman would retain their memories and their psychic power, repeating this cycle of physical death and biological rebirth across countless generations. They walked alongside the migrating tribes, using their psychic foresight to find underground water sources, predict the movement of caribou herds, and heal infected wounds by accelerating cellular regeneration. As the human population expanded across the continents, the tribes carved territorial lines into the dirt. Men drove sharpened bronze blades into the chests of their rivals to claim access to fresh water and grazing land. They burned neighboring villages to the ground, taking slaves and hoarding resources. This continuous outpouring of violence, ambition, and cruelty fed the immaterium. The currents of psychic energy shifted from silver and blue to oily black and crimson. Dark, predatory entities coalesced within the churning plasma of the warp. Massive serpentine shapes made of violet energy coiled through the psychic currents, manifesting jagged appendages of concentrated kinetic force. The shamans observed this transformation from their trances. They watched the predatory entities hunt the migrating souls of their peers. When a shaman died, their soul entered the warp, and the predators immediately swarmed the bright sphere of psychic energy. The entities tore the silver spheres apart, absorbing the energy and dissolving the shaman's consciousness into the swirling chaos of the Empyrean. The surviving shamans calculated the structural integrity of their own souls. They determined their psychic forms retained enough cohesion for exactly one more physical transfer before the predators would consume them completely. Seeking a method to preserve their accumulated knowledge and ensure the survival of the human species, the shamans initiated a massive global migration. Thousands of these psychic men and women left their respective tribes. They walked across sprawling glaciers, sailed across wide oceans in hollowed-out tree trunks, and trekked across blistering sand deserts. They converged on a single, massive subterranean cavern located deep beneath a high mountain plateau. Inside the cavern, thousands of shamans sat shoulder to shoulder in massive concentric circles upon the damp stone floor. They ignited hundreds of small fires, filling the cavern with the heavy smoke of burning pine branches and dried sage. Through spoken languages and projected psychic imagery, they shared visions of the future. They projected images of human skulls crushed under iron treads, continents engulfed in atomic fire, and the physical boundary between the warp and real space tearing open to spill demons onto the earth. They concluded that their individual psychic energies lacked the sheer density to survive the hostile currents of the warp. Therefore, they decided to pool their life forces together into a single, impenetrable mass. The shamans gathered toxic root extracts, crushed hemlock seeds, and the extracted venom of horned vipers. They mixed these lethal substances together in heavy clay bowls, stirring the dark liquid with wooden spoons. Thousands of shamans raised the clay bowls to their lips simultaneously. They swallowed the bitter poison and set the empty bowls upon the cavern floor. The physical effects of the toxins rapidly dismantled their biological functions. Saliva pooled at the corners of their mouths, and their jaw muscles locked tightly together. Capillaries in their eyes burst, flooding their sclera with dark red blood. Their bodies convulsed violently, limbs trembling as the neurotoxins severed the signals from their brains to their muscles. Their breathing grew shallow, and soon their lungs stopped pulling in oxygen entirely. Thousands of bodies slumped forward onto the cold stone, their hearts ceasing to beat in near unison. Silence fell over the cavern, broken only by the crackle of the dying fires and the hiss of escaping steam. In the immaterium, thousands of bright silver spheres of psychic energy plunged into the chaotic currents simultaneously. The predatory warp entities detected the massive influx of energy and swarmed toward the souls, extending their jagged claws to consume the harvest. However, before the predators could reach them, the thousands of silver spheres accelerated toward one another. They smashed together at the center of the swarm, fusing their psychic borders into a single, blinding core of golden light. The fusion triggered a massive shockwave of pure psychic force. The expanding ring of golden energy struck the predatory entities, incinerating their forms and scattering their remains into base psychic vapor. The thousands of individual consciousnesses compressed and folded into one another, creating a single soul of unprecedented density and power. This massive golden entity radiated a light so intense it calmed the immediate currents of the warp, pushing the darkness away from its edges. The massive golden soul then turned its focus back toward the physical universe. It pierced the boundary between the immaterium and real space, streaking down through the upper atmosphere of Terra. The entity locked its trajectory onto a cluster of small, mud-brick huts situated along the winding banks of the Sakarya River in central Anatolia, plummeting directly toward the womb of a mortal woman resting inside. Water flowed over rounded grey stones in the channel of the Sakarya River, depositing rich silt along the muddy banks. 50 structures of sun-baked clay and timber stood in a tight cluster beside the water. Woven reeds formed the roofs of these dwellings, trapping the thick smoke of central hearth fires inside the single-room enclosures. Men and women with skin darkened by ultraviolet exposure walked between the structures, carrying woven baskets filled with freshly gathered einkorn wheat. The sharp scent of crushed garlic, burning pine branches, and wet sheep wool hung over the settlement. Inside one of the larger clay structures, a woman lay on a bed of dried river grass. Strings of salted fish hung from the wooden rafters above her, slowly curing in the ambient heat. Sweat coated the woman's forehead and plastered her dark hair to her neck. She contracted her abdominal muscles, pushing with heavy, gasping exhalations. An older woman with deep wrinkles around her eyes knelt beside the bed, catching the newborn infant as it slipped from the birth canal. The older woman took a flake of sharp black obsidian and sliced through the umbilical cord. The infant took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the smoke-scented air. He remained completely silent, staring up at the thatched roof with wide, dark eyes. His mother reached out with calloused hands, pulling the child against her chest and wrapping him in a tanned goat hide. His father stood near the doorway, holding a long wooden spear tipped with carved bone. The father spoke to the older woman, producing sharp, guttural consonants and rolled vowels from the back of his throat. These vocalizations formed a Proto-Indo-European dialect, carrying the precise phonetic structure that would later evolve into the Hittite language. The older woman nodded, wiping maternal blood from her hands with a damp cloth. Two young children, a boy and a girl, peered around their father's legs to look at their new brother. They possessed standard human biological traits, displaying the dark hair, brown eyes, and narrow facial structures of their parents. The newborn presented the exact same baseline physical characteristics, appearing as a standard human male. As the planet completed its first full orbit around the sun following his birth, the child grew alongside his siblings in the Anatolian settlement. He walked on bare feet through the mud of the riverbank, helping his father herd domesticated goats into wooden pens. He sat beside his mother as she ground wheat across flat basalt stones, listening to the rhythmic, grating sound of rock scraping against rock. Simultaneously, extreme deviations in his neurobiology began to manifest. His cerebral cortex developed a density far exceeding standard human parameters. Electrical impulses fired across his synapses at a hyper-accelerated rate, generating a localized, highly concentrated bioelectric field around his physical form. When he looked directly at the goats in the pen, the animals immediately stopped bleating and lowered their heads to the dirt, compelled by the sheer pressure of his psychic aura. When he pointed his small fingers at a dying orange ember in the hearth, the residual heat flared upward, igniting into a tall, bright yellow flame. He was the first of a mutated human subspecies, possessing an unprecedented biological framework. His cellular structure regenerated damaged tissue at immense speed. When he scraped his knee on a sharp river stone, the epidermal cells multiplied and sealed the laceration within seconds, leaving smooth, unblemished skin behind. His optical nerves processed light across a wider spectrum, allowing him to see the thermal heat signatures of rodents moving through the tall grass and the bright bioelectric auras surrounding the humans in his village. He absorbed the phonetic sounds of his family's language, mapping the complex linguistic patterns in his hyperdense brain and achieving complete vocal fluency within weeks. He calculated the trajectory of falling rain, the exact rotational angle of the stars above the settlement, and the biological lifespans of the flora growing along the Sakarya River just by observing their physical states. His psychic capabilities expanded as his physical body increased in mass and bone density. He sat on the edge of the river, projecting his consciousness outward into the surrounding environment. He felt the subtle vibrations of earthworms moving through the wet soil beneath his feet. He heard the accelerated heartbeats of predatory felines stalking prey miles away in the dense brush. When he focused his optical nerves on a heavy granite boulder resting in the mud, the kinetic energy of his mind gripped the stone. The boulder lifted 2 feet into the air, hovering silently above the ground, until he severed the mental connection, dropping the heavy rock back into the mud with a loud splash. He understood the biological mechanics of his own body, actively directing his cellular growth and reinforcing his skeletal structure with dense deposits of calcium. Over the next 20 solar cycles, the child grew into a tall, broad-shouldered man. He stood a full head taller than his father, with thick, densely packed musculature shifting beneath his sun-darkened skin. He watched his parents age. Their skin lost its elasticity, their hair turned white, and their joints swelled with painful calcium deposits. He observed the same physical decay in his siblings, watching their teeth loosen and their vision cloud with cataracts. His own cellular degeneration ceased entirely. His telomeres locked into a state of permanent repair, maintaining his cells at peak biological efficiency. He realized his physical form would remain in this exact state, resisting all pathogens, repairing all cellular damage instantly, and sustaining his vital functions indefinitely. He packed a woven pouch with dried meat and filled a clay canteen with fresh river water. He stepped away from the mud-brick structures of his youth, walking out across the Anatolian plains to begin an endless journey across the surface of the world. A bronze-tipped spear drove through the abdominal muscles of the tall man, severing his intestines and fracturing his lower spine. The attacking warrior pulled the wooden shaft back, expecting the tall man to collapse into the blood-soaked mud. The tall man remained standing. Within milliseconds, the severed tissues of his internal organs knitted back together. Bone marrow extruded fresh calcium, sealing the fracture in his spine. The punctured epidermis closed, leaving smooth, unblemished skin over the impact site. The tall man raised his hand, releasing a concentrated wave of kinetic force that threw the attacking warrior 30 feet through the air. The man possessed a biological classification known as a perpetual. His cellular structure maintained continuous, infinite regeneration, repairing fatal biological trauma instantly and halting the cellular aging process entirely. Inside his hyperdense cerebral cortex, he retained the exact memories of the thousands of psychic men and women who had consumed crushed hemlock seeds inside the mountain cavern. He recalled the burning sensation of the toxins and the blinding fusion of their souls within the immaterium. He understood his biological form functioned as the permanent vessel for that combined psychic energy. His cells would continue dividing without telomere degradation. He would bypass the cycle of physical death and biological rebirth completely, existing continuously across the entire span of human development. He walked away from the early settlements of the Sakarya River, moving across the expanding continents as human populations multiplied. He covered his shoulders in cured animal hides, trading them centuries later for woven silk garments, and eventually for thick, lead-lined radiation suits. He stood beside stonemasons under the blistering sun, carving geometric angles into limestone blocks to demonstrate the structural stability of the load-bearing arch. He sat in dimly lit scriptoriums, grinding lapis lazuli into blue pigment and dragging ink-tipped quills across dried parchment to record the rotational patterns of the planetary bodies. He stood in the loud, sulfur-scented foundries of the industrial eras, pouring liquid iron into sand molds and manipulating the carbon content to produce flexible steel. As the humans around him aged, their hair turning grey and their spines bowing under the pull of gravity, he retained his exact physical prime. To avoid the scrutiny of the local populations, he constantly relocated across the planetary surface. He adopted new phonetic titles and adjusted his vocal patterns to match the shifting regional dialects. He wore the heavy gold crowns of regional monarchs, ruling from high stone thrones for a few decades before leaving the garments behind and walking away into the wilderness. He carried the wooden staves of traveling scholars, wrapped his face in the dust-stained cloth of nomadic merchants, and wore the heavy iron plating of frontline infantry commanders. He stood behind the shoulders of planetary rulers, speaking quietly into their ears and directing their military and agricultural logistics. He operated entirely from the shadows, steering the technological and cultural expansion of the human species while keeping his own permanent biological nature concealed. His physical immortality worked in tandem with his immense psychic capabilities. He walked through crowded city squares, projecting a telepathic field that manipulated the optical nerves of the surrounding humans. The crowds looked directly at him and perceived a completely different face, ignoring his towering height and dense musculature. He reached out with his mind to alter the atmospheric pressure, calling down heavy rain clouds to hydrate failing wheat crops. He projected kinetic barriers to deflect incoming artillery shells during global conflicts. He absorbed the psychic resonance of trillions of human minds, watching their technological progression advance from steam-powered engines to fusion reactors and faster-than-light propulsion drives. He watched the massive colony vessels ignite their thrusters and break through the gravitational pull of Terra, carrying the human species out into the wider galaxy. He observed the human species spread across the stars, and he watched them collapse back into the dirt during the violent warp storms of the Age of Strife. He walked across the radioactive glass plains of Terra in the 29th millennium, stepping over the crushed skulls of the techno-barbarians. He saw the toxic sludge filling the dried ocean beds and the ash blocking out the sun. The human species had fractured into scattered, violent tribes hoarding rusted machinery. His subtle manipulations and whispered guidance over the past tens of thousands of years had failed to maintain the structural integrity of the planetary civilization. He walked down into the deep subterranean bunkers beneath the Himalayan mountains, surrounded by the humming geothermal generators and the amber incubation vats. He placed heavy plates of golden auramite armor over his broad shoulders and locked a massive, power-wreathed sword to his hip. He looked at the incubating super soldiers floating in the amniotic fluid around him. He prepared to abandon the shadows of human history, deciding to step out into the ash-choked daylight and enforce his direct, physical authority over the broken world. He walked up the wide ferrocrete ramp leading out of the deep Himalayan bunker, his heavy boots striking the metal grating with a steady, rhythmic clanking. The thick adamantium doors retracted into the mountain walls, scraping against centuries of accumulated rock dust and grinding on massive steel gears. Harsh, unfiltered sunlight pierced the dense atmospheric smog layer, striking the polished golden auramite plating on his broad shoulders and reflecting a brilliant glare across the dark stone. He stood at the edge of a high cliff, looking down at the sprawling valleys filled with irradiated ash, collapsed hive spires, and rivers of toxic chemical runoff. For tens of thousands of solar cycles, he had watched these plains while wearing the coarse wool cloaks of wandering scholars, the heavy iron plating of anonymous infantrymen, and the dust-stained tunics of nomadic merchants. He reached up and unclasped the worn leather fastener of a ragged traveler's cloak, letting the brown fabric slip from his shoulders and fall into the ash swirling around his boots. He gripped the hilt of his massive sword and locked the power node into the activation matrix. The heavy blade vibrated with a bright, crackling energy field, casting a blue light against the sheer rock face of the mountain. Lifting his chin, he focused his hyperdense optical nerves on the sky above the smog. Beyond the planetary atmosphere, the thick bands of kinetic plasma and warp radiation thinned, dissolving into transparent, traversable currents. The crushing psychic pressure that had pressed down on his cerebral cortex for millennia lifted. He mapped the celestial coordinates in his mind, tracing lines between the Sol system and the distant star clusters where human colonies rested in complete isolation. He analyzed the physical state of the human species, observing the genetic degradation, the widespread biological mutations, and the hostile xenos lifeforms spreading across the galaxy. He calculated the exact mathematical probability of human survival under their current divided, warring structure, watching the projected numbers drop rapidly towards zero. He turned away from the cliff edge and walked back to a heavy iron table, positioned near the bunker entrance. He unrolled a massive parchment map detailing the ruined continents of Terra, pressing the curling corners down with spent artillery casings. He picked up a thick stick of black charcoal and dragged it across the textured paper, drawing a single, continuous circle around the entire landmass of the planet. He pressed the charcoal firmly against the parchment, marking the territories of the ruling warlords. He drew heavy black crosses over the sunken ocean beds of the Pan-Pacific empires, the high spires of High Brazil, and the sprawling, toxic steppes of Ursh. He sketched the initial routes of his military advance, calculating the fuel consumption, the terrain elevation, and the exact caloric requirements for a marching army. He established his central command post inside the high mountain fortress, configuring the heavy brass communication arrays to broadcast across the surrounding peaks. He projected his golden psychic aura over the rock formations, casting a physical light that guided the scattered tribes living in the shadows of the Himalayan range toward his gates. Men and women, clothed in irradiated animal pelts and carrying rusted solid slug rifles, walked up the steep, winding mountain paths. They gathered in the massive stone courtyard, dropping their weapons onto the flagstones as they looked up at the towering, golden-armored figure standing on the high balcony. He spoke to them directly, projecting his voice across the courtyard with concentrated psychic resonance. He ordered the men and women to strip the rusted scrap metal from their bodies and cast it into the smelting furnaces. He commanded them to dig deep trenches into the mountain rock, to lay copper piping for purified water, and to construct massive foundries along the cliff edges. As the massive furnaces ignited, filling the courtyard with the intense heat of molten iron, he walked among the gathering crowds, handing them newly forged bolter rifles manufactured in the automated vaults below. He pointed the tip of his power sword toward the territories marked on his map, outlining a campaign of total planetary integration. He returned to his iron command table, reviewing long columns of logistical data scrolling down the glowing green screens of his brass chronometers. He calculated the exact trajectory of his impending campaign, observing the numbers indicating the projected casualties necessary to subjugate the techno-barbarian empires. The data streams displayed millions of expected fatalities, hundreds of destroyed settlements, and mountains of expended munitions. He picked up a metal stylus and signed his authorization across the bottom of the casualty ledgers, pressing the ink deeply into the parchment. He directed the automated fabricators to produce miles of white medical bandages, massive vats of coagulant chemicals, and thousands of heavy canvas body bags. He stood inside the armory, watching the conveyor belts feed thousands of mass-reactive bolter shells into ammunition crates, smelling the sharp scent of cordite and heated brass. He accepted the accumulation of corpses required to fuse the fractured tribes into a single, cohesive military structure. He stacked the crates of ammunition, ordered the loading of the heavy transport vehicles, and prepared his weapons to break the remaining warlords of Terra. Before he would loose his newly forged soldiers upon the ash plains, he finalized the symbols that would mark his conquests, shaping the emblem of his supreme authority and unparalleled scientific mastery. He stood over the heavy iron dissection tables in the lowest levels of the Himalayan fortress, driving a steel scalpel through the thick, mutated dermal plating of a captured enemy combatant. He pulled back the stiff, grey skin and examined the enlarged bone structure resting beneath the muscle tissue. He dictated complex sequences of chemical formulas into a brass recording horn, logging the exact genetic deviations and cellular decay caused by centuries of radiation exposure. He wiped the dark blood from his gauntlets with a coarse cloth, walked across the damp stone floor of the laboratory, and picked up a heavy, newly fabricated plasma rifle. He calibrated the focusing lenses along the barrel, adjusting the internal magnetic containment field with precise, calculated turns of a heavy wrench. He aimed the weapon at a solid block of iron positioned at the end of the testing chamber and fired a concentrated beam of blue light, melting the target into a pool of glowing, liquid slag. He moved directly from the laboratories to the firing ranges, striking down automated combat servitors with mathematically perfect swings of his power sword. His physical movements displayed total biomechanical efficiency, utilizing every ounce of kinetic energy to sever hydraulic limbs and crush steel chassis. Inside the central command chamber, he stared at massive phosphor monitors displaying real-time troop movements across the sprawling Ursh steppes. He analyzed the topographical data, the barometric pressure drops indicating incoming acid storms, and the calculated ammunition reserves of the opposing techno-barbarian forces simultaneously. He anticipated the enemy flanks shifting south based on the shifting wind patterns. He dragged a heavy brass marker across his map, routing his own artillery divisions to the exact coordinates where the enemy would arrive 3 days later. The tribal leaders standing beside his command table watched his eyes dart across the glowing green screens. They saw him process thousands of raw data points every second, computing logistical outcomes with the speed of an integrated logic engine. They stepped back toward the stone walls, lowering their heads as they observed the concentrated golden light radiating from his skin. They watched him lift a heavy iron munitions crate from the floor, using the kinetic force of his mind, levitating it through the air and setting it onto a transport cart while maintaining his gaze upon the tactical monitors. He unrolled a detailed topographical map of a densely populated techno-feudal state. The settlement contained thousands of mud brick dwellings, towering water purification silos, and heavy defensive ferrocrete walls. The enemy warlord had positioned his heavy artillery batteries directly in the center of the civilian habitation zones, surrounded by high-density population centers. He measured the blast radius of his high-yield bombardment cannons using a pair of iron calipers. He calculated the exact explosive yields required to vaporize the enemy artillery and collapse the bunker networks beneath them. The dials on his brass chronometers indicated a projected collateral fatality count of 40,000 unarmed men, women, and children. He picked up his metal stylus and pressed the ink firmly into the parchment, authorizing the strike. He stood before the monitor screens hours later, watching bright flashes of atomic fire erase the entire settlement from the map. He recorded the resulting stabilization of the region, noting the complete elimination of the hostile warlord and the securing of the vital freshwater reservoirs. He catalogued the dead in his ledgers, closed the thick leather book, and immediately began drafting the architectural blueprints for a massive fortified aqueduct system to be built directly over the glowing blast craters. He walked down to the primary forge, standing before an anvil of solid black iron. He placed a thick sheet of pure gold auramite onto the flat surface and raised a heavy, heated hammer. He struck the metal repeatedly, bending the edges and shaping the flat surface to fit the contours of a heavy chest plate. He utilized precision laser cutters to engrave a specific emblem directly into the center of the gold. He carved the sharp, hooked beak of an avian raptor, detailing the overlapping feathers along the creature's neck. He cut jagged, branching lines of lightning clutched beneath the avian head, digging the deep grooves into the thick armor. He poured liquid silver into the engraved lines, letting the contrasting metal cool and harden. He bolted the finished plate over his chest, displaying the silver eagle and lightning to the thousands of soldiers marching through his courtyard. He stood on the high stone balcony, looking down at the unaugmented humans gripping their newly forged bolter rifles. He analyzed their baseline biology, calculating their muscle density, oxygen consumption rates, and bone tensile strength. He observed their chests heaving with exertion, their boots dragging under the heavy weight of their iron armor, and their lungs straining in the irradiated atmosphere. He determined the baseline human physiology operated far below the raw kinetic output and biological resilience required to crush the heavily fortified warlords of Terra. He turned away from the balcony and walked back into the deep subterranean laboratories, unsealing the heavy vault doors leading to his experimental biological incubation tanks. He began extracting specific strands of raw genetic material, preparing to engineer a completely new biological template designed exclusively for shock assault and overwhelming physical violence. Deep within the gene forges of the Himalaysian laboratories, glass fluid lines pumped highly concentrated amino acids into large brass incubation pods. Within the tanks, organic matter expanded at an accelerated rate, forming thick layers of muscle tissue over heavily reinforced skeletal structures. He adjusted the dials on the control panels, monitoring the electrical impulses firing across the developing cerebral cortices of his creations. He engineered these new biological templates with a singular purpose, discarding longevity and long-term stability in favor of immediate, overwhelming physical dominance. He spliced aggressive hormonal triggers directly into their endocrine systems, ensuring a constant state of hyper-aroused combat readiness. The flesh within the tanks expanded rapidly, producing men who stood over 8 feet tall, their bodies packed with dense, bulging muscle mass. He named them the Thunder Warriors, outfitting the massive soldiers in thick, overlapping plates of powered iron. The crude power armor featured heavy bronze power packs mounted on the back, feeding energy to the servos, articulating the thick shoulder and leg joints. The armor lacked environmental sealing or advanced radiation shielding, focusing entirely on kinetic deflection and brute force melee enhancement. The Thunder Warriors carried large, drum-fed bolter rifles and massive chainswords equipped with roaring, motorized teeth. They stood in the primary courtyards in tight, disciplined formations, their heavy boots cracking the flagstones beneath them. The sharp smell of engine grease and ozone radiated from their humming power packs. He rode at the forefront of the formation, seated inside a heavy, gold-plated command vehicle. The Thunder Warriors marched out of the mountain passes and onto the sprawling, ash-covered plains of Terra. They encountered the first techno-barbarian warlord armies entrenched behind heavy ferrocrete barricades and rusted iron spikes. The enemy warlords unleashed thousands of unaugmented soldiers, firing solid slug rifles and crude plasma projectors across the flat terrain. The Thunder Warriors broke into a full sprint, their massive iron boots tearing up the dried earth. Incoming rifle rounds flattened against their chest plates, and glancing plasma strikes merely scorched the thick iron without penetrating the underlying flesh. The super soldiers crashed directly into the enemy lines, swinging their heavy chainswords in wide, sweeping arcs. The motorized teeth tore through the rusted scrap metal armor of the techno-barbarians, shredding bone and organ tissue in bursts of dark blood. The Thunder Warriors fired their bolters at point-blank range, the mass-reactive shells detonating inside the chests of the enemy infantry, blowing large, jagged craters through their torsos. Their genetically engineered aggression drove them forward without pause. They ignored superficial wounds, continuing to crush skulls and snap spines with their heavy, armored gauntlets. The warlords watched their massive, augmented brutes, creatures engineered with chemical steroids and grafted armor, charge the Thunder Warriors. A towering brute swung a heavy hydraulic claw toward a Thunder Warrior's head. The super soldier sidestepped the heavy blow, drove his bolter rifle directly into the brute's abdomen, and emptied the entire ammunition drum. The explosive force hollowed out the brute's torso, dropping the massive corpse to the ground. The sheer kinetic ferocity of the Thunder Warriors shattered the morale of the opposing armies. Surviving techno-barbarians dropped their weapons and fled across the ash plains, completely overwhelmed by the raw, brutal shock assault of the engineered super soldiers. He observed the battlefield from the command vehicle, noting the exact fatality rates and the complete decimation of the enemy formations. The Thunder Warriors secured the captured bunkers, ripping the heavy iron doors off their hinges to seize the hoarded technology inside. They dragged the surviving warlords into the open plains, forcing them onto their knees in the mud. He stepped out of the command vehicle, walking toward the defeated rulers. The golden light radiating from his auramite armor cast long shadows across the broken ground. He offered the surviving warlords a singular choice: integrate their territories and remaining resources into his growing empire, or face total annihilation. The warlords looked at the towering, blood-soaked Thunder Warriors standing behind him, the motors of their chainswords still idling. They pressed their foreheads against the dirt, swearing total allegiance to the golden-armored conqueror. The rapid subjugation of these initial territories provided a massive influx of raw materials and manpower. He directed the captured populations to begin constructing long supply roads, moving convoys of extracted ore and fresh water back toward his mountain fortress. He observed the physical deterioration beginning to affect the Thunder Warriors. Their accelerated biological growth caused rapid cellular breakdown, resulting in unpredictable organ failure and massive internal hemorrhaging. He calculated the exact lifespan of his creations, confirming they possessed only enough biological stability to complete the planetary conquest. He accepted this calculated obsolescence, utilizing their massive combat potential while ignoring the inevitable degradation of their physical forms. He ordered the armies to regroup, loading fresh ammunition crates into the transport vehicles, preparing to drive his unstoppable shock troops deeper into the fortified territories of the most powerful techno-empires remaining on the planet. He stood upon the high ferrocrete battlements of the Himalaysian fortress, looking down at the expanding staging grounds carved directly into the mountain rock. Before the heavy iron vats began producing the mass formations of the Thunder Warriors, he deployed highly concentrated squads to secure the immediate perimeters. 10 figures stood at the base of the battlements, clad in interlocking plates of bright, unpainted auramite. They possessed physical dimensions exceeding even the later Thunder Warriors, engineered through bespoke cellular alchemy rather than mass-produced hormonal grafting. These men, the Custodian Guard, gripped long guardian spears, topped with heavy power blades and integrated bolter mechanisms. He dispatched these precise formations to eliminate specific techno-barbarian strongholds. The Custodians walked across the ash fields, activating localized grav field generators to bypass buried fragmentation mines. They breached heavy bunker doors using focused microwave lasers, melting the thick steel hinges into liquid slag, and severed the spinal columns of opposing warlords with exact, mathematically calculated thrusts of their power blades. They neutralized command structures with zero wasted kinetic energy, leaving the surrounding civilian habitation zones completely untouched by collateral damage. The topographical maps spread across his iron command table showed the borders of his control expanding outward across the Asian and European continents. The physical space required thousands of bodies to hold the supply lines and garrison the captured freshwater reservoirs. The 10-man custodian fire teams eliminated the tyrants, leaving vast tracts of irradiated steppes empty and vulnerable to roaming scavenger tribes. He processed the logistical data scrolling down the brass monitors and issued direct commands to the subterranean armories and incubation vaults. He scaled up the genetic production of the Thunder Warriors, filling the empty staging grounds with thousands of the towering, ironclad shock troops. They provided the sheer biological mass and high-volume bolter fire necessary to maintain the perimeter lines across thousands of miles of hostile territory, their heavy boots cracking the rock as they established fortified checkpoints. Behind the towering ranks of the Thunder Warriors, dense phalanxes of unaugmented human soldiers marched across the mountain courtyards. These men and women formed the core of the mortal auxiliary units. The Geno 5-2 Chiliad stepped in perfect synchronization, wearing heavy coats of gray-spun canvas and thick, rubberized rebreather masks. They carried standardized, mass-produced las carbines, connected via thick copper cables to heavy power packs strapped to their shoulders. Genetic technicians walked between their lines, extracting blood samples with glass syringes to monitor the precise, engineered breeding programs that maintains the physical uniformity of the Chiliad regiments. The soldiers of the Geno 5-2 locked their las carbines against their shoulders and fired coordinated volleys at distant rock targets, projecting synchronized lines of red thermal energy that scorched the stone faces black. To the left of the grey-coated infantry, the Inferalti Hussars rode heavy, broad-chested terrestrial equines across the packed dirt of the training fields. The animals possessed thick muscle grafts and breathed through internal filtration lung sacs, blowing streams of hot white steam from their flared nostrils. The equines carried heavy plates of riveted iron barding across their flanks, their massive iron-shod hooves throwing up clods of dirt with every stride. The hussars sat in high leather saddles, wearing overlapping scale armor and holding long thermal lances. The tips of the lances glowed with contained plasma heat, leaving thin trails of distorted air as the cavalry units executed rapid flanking maneuvers. He watched the hussars coordinate with the Thunder Warriors, driving their iron-clad mounts through the gaps in the infantry lines and lowering their thermal lances to pierce the reinforced engine blocks of captured enemy transport vehicles, boiling the fuel lines inside. Deep within the most secured levels of the mountain laboratories, beyond the Thunder Warrior incubation vats, he initiated the next phase of biological engineering. He observed subjects lying on surgical tables as automated mechanical arms implanted secondary organs into their chest cavities. Laser scalpels cut through their rib cages, and brass retractors held the flesh open as ceramic bone-fusing agents bonded the ribs into solid, interlocking plates. These subjects, the proto-Astartes, stood up from the surgical tables, displaying physical proportions leaner and more stabilized than the massive, hulking Thunder Warriors. They clad their dense bodies in unpainted gray ceramite, a highly resilient thermal dissipating compound, and gripped heavy bolter variants specifically calibrated for their reinforced skeletal structures. He calculated their cellular stability, noting the absence of the rapid organ failure that plagued the Thunder Warriors, ensuring these new soldiers possessed the biological endurance to wage continuous warfare over the span of centuries. He consolidated these diverse military assets into a single, cohesive fighting force. The custodians, the thunder warriors, the mortal regiments, and the developing proto-Astartes formed a massive column of iron, auramite, and canvas stretching out from the Himalaysian gates. They raised a massive cloud of grey dust that choked the horizon, marching in sequence to the steady pounding of large iron drums. They required immense quantities of raw materials, forged weaponry, and advanced machinery to sustain a global campaign of this magnitude. He looked across the tactical monitors at a specific geographical coordinate located deep within the Ural Mountains. He recognized the glowing red thermal signatures radiating from massive subterranean forge complexes controlled by an isolated faction of human engineers. He directed his forces toward those mountains, plotting a direct interception course to secure the industrial capacity needed to arm his expanding host. The massive column of iron, auramite, and canvas advanced across the dried salt flats of the central steppes, raising a continuous plume of grey dust that settled over the heavy armor of the thunder warriors. They marched toward the jagged peaks of the Ural Mountains. Massive exhaust stacks protruded directly from the granite rock faces, venting continuous columns of thick black smog into the upper atmosphere. Heavy iron blast doors, 50 feet high and reinforced with riveted titanium crossbeams, sealed the natural caverns at the base of the mountains. This was the domain of the Terra clan, an enclave of human engineers and techno-artisans who operated mountain-sized forges built during the height of the lost human colonial era. Inside the subterranean caverns, the heat of tapped magma currents turned the air thick and difficult to breathe. Conveyor lines of stamped steel moved across the suspended catwalks, carrying raw iron ore toward massive crucible vats, bubbling with liquid metal. The members of the Terra clan walked along the gantries wearing heavy, lead-lined aprons and thick leather gloves. Many possessed heavy mechanical augmentations, replacing their biological eyes with multi-lens optical arrays to inspect the microfractures in freshly forged gears. They stood behind the thick viewing slits of their blast doors, watching the massive army halt in the ash plains below. The long barrels of Thunder Warrior bolters and the thermal lances of the Infernalty hussars pointed directly at the mountain fortress. The Emperor issued a command through his voxcaster, ordering the main host to hold their positions. He walked forward across the rocky incline, accompanied only by the 10 towering figures of the custodian guard. He approached the massive iron blast doors and waited. The heavy gears grinding inside the mountain echoed across the valley, and the doors slowly retracted into the stone walls, sliding back on lubricated tracks. The Emperor and his golden escort walked into the intense heat of the primary forge. The elders of the Terra clan stood on the central ferrocrete platform, gripping heavy hydraulic wrenches and laser cutters, their mechanical ocular lenses whirring as they focused on the towering figure in golden auramite. The Emperor bypassed the protocols of initial parley. He walked past the elders and stepped directly toward a massive, stalled plasma reactor dominating the center of the cavern. The reactor's heavy brass cooling coils were coated in black carbon scoring, and the central glass containment cylinder flickered with a dim, failing red light. He placed his gauntlets on the heavy access panels, pulled them aside, and reached into the complex network of fused copper wiring and cracked ceramic insulators. He adjusted the magnetic alignment rings with precise twists of his armored fingers, rerouted the thermal exhaust vents, and fused a broken connection, utilizing a concentrated burst of psychic heat from his palm. The reactor instantly vibrated with a deep, resonant hum, and the central cylinder ignited with a blinding, stable blue plasma sphere. He turned back to the Terawatt elders and spoke to them using their own heavily encrypted mathematical dialect. He detailed the exact thermodynamic flaws in their previous containment field and provided the specific chemical formulas required to stabilize the magma taps beneath their mountain. He pointed to the restored reactor, demonstrating his complete mastery over the scientific principles they worshipped. Then, he raised a hand and pointed back through the open blast doors, gesturing toward the thousands of Thunder Warriors standing in absolute silence upon the ash plains. He laid out the terms of integration. He offered to upgrade their failing machinery, expand their production lines, and protect their mountain vaults, requiring their total industrial output and absolute loyalty in return. The Terawatt elders calculated the parameters of the exchange. They observed the perfectly stabilized plasma reactor and the towering, heavily armed soldiers waiting outside the gates. They set their wrenches and laser cutters onto the ferrocrete platform and lowered themselves onto their knees, pressing their foreheads against the hot metal grating. The Emperor accepted their submission, immediately directing his custodians to secure the primary transit corridors of the mountain, while he took direct control over the central cogitator banks. The integration of the Terawatt clan altered the physical loadouts of the expanding army. The Emperor reprogrammed the automated assembly lines, inputting blueprints from his own archives. The heavy stamping machines began producing Volkite weapons, advanced thermal ray projectors featuring heavy brass acceleration coils and thick glass focusing lenses. These weapons emitted concentrated beams of raw thermal energy that caused organic targets to rapidly combust, turning flesh and bone to ash in milliseconds. The Thunder Warriors marched into the armories and exchanged their crude solid slug bolters for these heavy Volkite charges. The technicians forged overlapping plates of hardened ceramite, upgrading the crude iron armor of the super soldiers with heavy environmental seals and reinforced power couplings. He watched the conveyor belts churn out thousands of newly fabricated ammunition cells, advanced plasma warheads, and heavy grav tanks. The mortal regiments of the Geno 5-2 Chiliad integrated localized communication beads into their thick helmets. The Emperor stood at the open blast doors of the Ural mountain forges, watching his fully armed legions form up across the plains. He unrolled his topographical map on a supply crate and marked heavy red lines leading outward from the mountains. He directed the vanguard units to march toward the massive, heavily fortified warlord enclaves holding the distant territories. The troops turned their newly forged weapons toward the toxic steppes of Ursh, the towering spires of High Brazil, and the blood-stained altars of the Molan Sen Confederacy, beginning the long march to subjugate the remaining empires. The brass dials inside the deep subterranean chronotors clicked over, marking the 800th year of the 29th millennium. Heavy iron treads of transport crawlers crushed the dry salt flats of the central steppes, pushing massive columns of grey dust into the polluted atmosphere. The golden-armored warlord directed his initial strikes against the fortified enclaves scattered across the equator and the southern hemisphere. In the territory of High Brazil, heavy transport flyers dropped gravity bombs onto the roofs of massive ferrocrete spires. Custodian guards deployed from the descending ramps, driving their power blades through the heavy reinforced bunker doors of the local tyrants. Volkite beams melted the steel support struts of the towering structures, collapsing the fortresses into heaps of burning slag and twisted rebar. Farther south, the Thunder Warriors marched across the dried, cracked mud of the Pan-Pacific Ocean beds. They descended into deep, excavated trench networks, firing their bolters at point-blank range into the massed tribal infantry. Mass-reactive shells punched directly through the crude iron breastplates of the defending soldiers, detonating inside their chest cavities and painting the trench walls with thick layers of dark blood. To the east, the iron-clad shock troops pushed into the toxic, yellow smog steppes of the Ursh. The Thunder Warriors swung their motorized chainswords through the densely packed ranks of the enemy, severing limbs and crushing skulls beneath their heavy boots, leaving miles of mutilated corpses baking under the harsh sun. The atmospheric temperature plummeted as the transport columns rotated their heavy treads toward the extreme northern latitudes. Frost crystallized along the edges of the golden auramite plating and accumulated over the bronze exhaust vents of the Thunder Warriors' power packs. The army crossed into the frozen tundra and deep pine forests occupied by the Marlan Sen Confederacy. The men and women of this northern domain wrapped their bodies in layers of thick wolf pelt and hardened leather. They gathered around massive altars constructed from rough-hewn granite blocks dragged across the ice. Priests wearing necklaces of human finger bones stood at the center of these stone structures. They gripped daggers carved from sharp volcanic glass, pressing the jagged edges against the throats of captured prisoners. The priests pulled the blades across the carotid arteries, allowing the hot, oxygenated blood to pour down the sides of the granite blocks and melt through the thick layers of white snow below. They stacked the severed heads of the sacrifices onto tall iron poles, aligning the empty eye sockets to face the incoming winter storms. High concentrations of raw psychic energy leaked from the pores of these priests, manifesting as purple static arcs jumping between their fingertips. The heavy transport crawlers broke through the dense tree line, snapping the frozen trunks of the massive pines beneath their front plows. The Thunder Warriors marched out of the blinding white snow squalls in tightly locked formations. The priests of the Marlan Sen shrieked guttural commands, directing thousands of genetically bulked berserkers to charge down the icy slopes. The berserkers injected chemical stimulants directly into their thick neck veins, their muscles swelling to massive proportions as they rushed toward the iron-clad lines with heavy steel axes raised high. The Thunder Warriors locked their boots into the permafrost and raised their bolter rifles. They discharged their weapons simultaneously, sending a dense wall of explosive munitions tearing through the freezing air. The shells impacted the charging berserkers, blowing massive craters through their chemically swollen torsos and scattering fragments of shattered ribs across the ice. The surviving berserkers crashed into the front line, swinging their steel axes against the thick ceramite shoulder plates of the super soldiers. The Thunder Warriors revved the motors of their chainswords and stepped into the melee. The spinning metal teeth tore through the thick hides and dense muscle tissue of the northern fighters. Hot blood sprayed through the air, freezing into red crystals before hitting the ground. The Emperor walked through the center of the chaotic battlefield, his golden armor repelling the heavy strikes of the enemy weapons. He approached the central granite altar. The ruling priest-king raised his hands, gathering a dense sphere of purple warp plasma between his palms. The Emperor swung his crackling power sword in a single, fluid arc, severing the priest-king's hands at the wrists before reversing the blade and decapitating the ruler. The intense heat of the power field cauterized the stump of the neck instantly, dropping the mutated body onto the snow-covered stone. Following the execution of the central command figure, the Thunder Warriors shifted their tactical stance. They locked their ranks into a wide, curving wedge formation, stretching across the entire width of the frozen valley. They advanced across the tundra with the synchronized rhythm of a farmer swinging a heavy iron scythe through a field of overgrown wheat. The warriors stepped forward in perfect unison, sweeping their chainswords from left to right, tearing through the remaining enemy combatants and leaving only a wide swath of severed flesh and crushed bone in their wake. They marched continuously over the frozen ground, exterminating the remaining pockets of resistance and securing the deep northern territories under the absolute authority of the Golden Warlord. The heavy iron boots of the army continued their march westward, leaving the blood-stained snow behind them. They walked until the ice fields gave way to dense grey fog, and the ground sloped upward into towering white chalk cliffs. The iron-armoured ranks halted at the edge of a deep, polluted channel, staring across the dark, chemical-stained water at the massive steam-powered dreadnoughts and thick ferrocrete bunkers of the warlords of Albia. The dark, chemical-stained water of the channel churned as the massive steam-powered dreadnoughts of Albia rotated their heavy brass propellers. Thick, black smoke billowed from the tall iron smokestacks of the dreadnoughts, coating the white chalk cliffs on the opposite shore in a layer of oily soot. On top of the cliffs, the warlords of Albia manned thick ferrocrete bunkers. They loaded heavy belt-fed autoguns and calibrated the brass targeting lenses of their artillery cannons. The Albians wore thick coats of insulated leather over riveted iron chest plates, gripping their weapons with calloused, grease-stained hands. The emperor stood among his golden custodian guard on the eastern shoreline, observing the fortified coastal defenses through the glowing optical sensors of his brass chronometers. He calculated the exact density of the ferrocrete walls and the payload capacities of the steam-powered dreadnoughts floating in the sulfur-scented water. He raised his crackling power sword, and the Thunder Warriors waded directly into the toxic channel. The acidic water hissed against their heavy iron armor, eating away the superficial paint and scoring the metal beneath. The Albion dreadnoughts opened fire, launching heavy armor-piercing artillery shells across the water. The massive projectiles struck the ranks of the Thunder Warriors, detonating on impact and tearing through the dense muscle and bone of the super soldiers. Plumes of displaced water and red blood erupted across the channel. The surviving Thunder Warriors continued their forward march, pushing through the churning current and firing their Volkite charges. The concentrated thermal beams struck the iron hulls of the dreadnoughts, melting the thick armor plating and boiling the pressurized water inside their steam boilers. The resulting thermal explosions ruptured the dreadnoughts, sending twisted chunks of burning metal raining down into the toxic water. The Thunder Warriors reached the base of the white chalk cliffs, driving their heavy boots into the steep, rocky inclines. The Albions fired downward from their ferrocrete bunkers, unleashing a continuous hail of solid slug ammunition. The bullets flattened against the reinforced ceramite plates of the advancing super soldiers, and the Thunder Warriors scaled the cliffs through the concentrated fire. They breached the bunkers by tearing the heavy steel doors off their hinges with their armored gauntlets. Inside the tight concrete corridors, the Thunder Warriors swung their motorized chainswords, ripping through the leather and iron armor of the Albion defenders. The Albions fought back with immense physical ferocity, detonating localized explosive charges inside their own bunkers to collapse the ceilings directly onto the advancing super soldiers. They drove combat knives into the vulnerable neck joints of the Thunder Warriors and fired their autoguns at point-blank range until their weapon barrels glowed red and melted from the continuous heat. The Emperor watched the high casualty rates scrolling across his tactical monitors. He observed the Thunder Warriors taking massive damage, losing hundreds of units to the entrenched Albion defense. He analyzed the combat tactics of the Albion soldiers, noting their absolute commitment to holding their positions and their highly coordinated defensive maneuvers. He recognized the extreme biological endurance and martial discipline possessed by these northern warriors. He ordered the Thunder Warriors to halt their advance and pull back their front lines, leaving the remaining Albion bunkers intact along the ridgeline. He walked forward across the chalk cliffs, standing in full view of the Albion gun emplacements. He deactivated the blue power field of his sword and drove the metal tip directly into the rocky ground. He projected his voice across the cliffside, using his psychic resonance, offering the Albion warlords a direct cessation of hostilities. He detailed the exact casualty projections for a continued siege, outlining the eventual destruction of their ferrocrete bunkers, and simultaneously offered them a place within his unified military structure. The Albion warlords looked at the towering golden figure, standing with open hands before their autoguns. They looked at the hundreds of destroyed Thunder Warriors scattered across their cliffs, recognizing the immense physical toll they had inflicted upon the Golden Warlords' army. The warlords lowered their weapons, stepping out of their ferrocrete bunkers to stand before the Emperor. They knelt upon the chalk cliffs, pressing their ironclad knees into the dirt, and pledged their entire population to his command. The Emperor directed his genetic technicians to gather blood and tissue samples from the surviving Albion soldiers. He transported these samples back to the deep incubation vaults of the Himalayan mountains. The dense muscle tissue and stable neurological pathways of the Albions provided the exact biological templates required to stabilize the production of his Proto-Astartes legions. The automated gene forges integrated the Albion genetic material, producing a new generation of soldiers clad in bare gray ceramite. He equipped these new warriors with standardized bolter rifles and aligned them in massive, disciplined formations across the staging grounds. They executed synchronized firing drills, their bolter rounds chewing the target ranges into fine gravel. With the northern territories secured and his army replenished by the fiercely resilient Albion stock, the Emperor turned his tactical monitors toward the sprawling, sun-baked continent to the east. He recalibrated the coordinates on his command table, plotting the marching routes toward the massive, heavily fortified borders of the Pan-Pacific Empire and the sprawling techno-citadels ruled by the tyrant Nathan Dume. The massive tracked transports of the Emperor's army rolled down the steep continental shelves into the dried, cracked basin of the Pan-Pacific Ocean. Miles of hardened salt flats stretched toward the horizon, interrupted by towering thermal vents, spewing thick plumes of yellow sulfur gas into the smog layer. Deep trenches cut through the salt, forming the sprawling subterranean trench cities of the Pan-Pacific Empire. Inside these chasms, millions of baseline humans worked in heavy atmospheric pressure suits, shoveling toxic mineral deposits onto massive steel conveyor belts. The sharp stench of refined promethium and acidic runoff hung heavily over the entire basin. Nathan Dume commanded this vast industrial complex from a suspended ferrocrete citadel bolted to the walls of the deepest tectonic rift. Nathan Dume sat on a throne constructed from the fused chassis of destroyed tank engines. He wore heavy lead-lined robes over a thick layer of grafted subdermal iron plating. His eyes possessed vertical, reptilian slits resulting from extensive biological tampering, and thick black veins pulsed along his jawline from the continuous injection of synthetic adrenaline. He commanded massive, sprawling armies comprised of heavily mutated shock troops. These soldiers possessed elongated upper limbs, dense musculature, and thick layers of scar tissue from continuous chemical burns. They carried heavy radiation projectors, brass tubes filled with volatile radioactive isotopes that fired concentrated beams of ionizing energy. The Emperor's golden command vehicle halted at the edge of the deepest trench network. He observed the heavily fortified ferrocrete bridges spanning the chasms. noting the thick clusters of radiation projectors bolted to the guardrails. He unrolled his topographical maps and placed his heavy iron calipers over the structural schematics of Nathan Dume's suspended citadel. He calculated the exact tensile strength of the titanium support cables anchoring the citadel to the rift walls. He directed the Thunder Warriors to disembark from the transport crawlers and form heavy phalanxes along the rim of the salt flats. The massive super soldiers locked heavy boarding shields together, creating a solid wall of thick ceramite and iron directly facing the enemy emplacements. The mutated soldiers of the Pan-Pacific Empire fired their radiation projectors up at the ridge. Beams of raw, green ionizing energy struck the Thunder Warriors' boarding shields, superheating the metal and stripping the gray paint from the ceramite. The Thunder Warriors pushed forward over the ridge, marching directly down the steep, rocky inclines while maintaining their shield walls. They fired their Volkite charges through the gaps in their shields. The thermal beams struck the mutated Pan-Pacific soldiers, instantly evaporating their internal fluids and turning their dense muscle tissue into piles of gray ash. The super soldiers stepped over the charred remains, advancing onto the heavy ferrocrete bridges spanning the chasms. Nathan Doom watched the advancing wall of shields through his multi-lens optical array. He shouted guttural commands into his brass Vox transmitter, sending thousands of heavily augmented brutes onto the narrow bridges. The brutes charged forward, swinging heavy, blunt iron hammers against the Thunder Warriors' shields. The sheer kinetic impact dented the ceramite plating and pushed the super soldiers back. The Thunder Warriors dropped their shields and swung their motorized chainswords into the mass of augmented bodies. The rotating steel teeth chewed through the thick scar tissue and dense bones of the brutes, scattering fragments of armor and flesh across the bridge grating. Dark blood coated the ferrocrete surfaces, causing the combatants to slip and fall into the deep, sulfur-filled trenches below. While the Thunder Warriors engaged the primary defensive forces on the bridges, the Emperor dispatched the 10 golden-armored custodian guards. The custodians rappelled down the sheer rock faces of the tectonic rift using thick carbon fiber cables. They landed directly onto the heavy titanium support struts, anchoring Nathan Dume's citadel to the canyon walls. The custodians activated the power fields on their guardian spears and drove the crackling blue blades directly into the thick titanium cables. The extreme heat of the power weapons melted through the high-density metal within seconds. The heavy cables snapped, whipping through the air and striking the ferrocrete walls of the citadel. Severed from the upper support cables, the massive ferrocrete citadel tilted forward, the thick steel girders bending and snapping under the shifting weight. The massive concrete structure slid down the side of the tectonic rift, crashing into the jagged rock outcroppings and shattering the lower observation decks into fragmented pieces. Thick clouds of gray concrete dust plumed upward from the impact site. Nathan Dume crawled out from the wreckage of his throne room, his lead-lined robes torn and his subdermal iron plating exposed to the sulphurous air. The custodian guards dropped onto the ruined deck, surrounding the tyrant. They drove the blunt hafts of their guardian spears into his knee joints, shattering the bone and forcing him to the ground. The Emperor walked down the ruined slope of the rift, stopping in front of the kneeling tyrant. He looked down at the mutated face of Nathan Doom, recording the specific genetic deviancies in his mind for later biological analysis. He raised his crackling power sword and drove the blade directly through the tyrant's chest, severing his spinal column and stopping his synthetic heart instantly. He pulled the blade free and walked past the collapsed citadel. He directed the automated fabricators to begin disassembling the Pan-Pacific factories and loading the raw materials into his transport crawlers. He secured the massive industrial output of the dried ocean basin, expanding his logistical capacity to new levels. He reviewed the brass chronometers inside his command vehicle, shifting the tactical display away from the equator. He aligned the targeting cursors on the massive, storm-racked plains stretching across the northern central landmass, directing the full weight of his iron-clad armies toward the sprawling, toxic empire of Ursh and the blood-soaked domains of the tyrant Caligan. Heavy acidic rain fell across the vast, barren expanse of the Ursh steppes, corroding the exposed iron treads of the Emperor's transport crawlers. Miles of deep, stagnant mud stretched in every direction, dotted with the rusted skeletal remains of crashed orbital haulers. At the center of this wasteland stood the massive, multi-tiered fortress of Caligan, the warlord of Ursh. Thick walls of reinforced steel scavenged directly from the hulls of derelict void ships, encircled a central citadel topped with high communication arrays. Caligan commanded his armies from inside a heavily shielded command bunker, wearing thick robes of woven human hair over a localized grav suspensor rig that carried his massive, genetically swollen bulk. He utilized deep warp sorcery alongside conventional heavy artillery, directing cadres of rogue psychers to summon dark, kinetic anomalies across the battlefield. The Thunder Warriors marched into the thick mud, their boots sinking deep into the corrosive sludge. Caligan's artillery batteries opened fire from the steel walls, launching heavy, high-explosive shells that detonated across the advancing lines. Chunks of shrapnel embedded themselves into the Thunder Warriors' ceramite plates, and the force of the blasts threw several super soldiers backward into the mud. Simultaneously, the rogue psychers of Ursh stood upon the high battlements, extending their hands toward the dark clouds above. They pulled raw warp energy through the thinning atmospheric barrier, manifesting localized gravitic distortions directly over the Emperor's formations. The atmospheric pressure multiplied exponentially within these anomalies, crushing the iron barding of the Inferalti Hussar equines and forcing the heavy transport crawlers to grind to a halt under the immense downward force. The Emperor stood in the open hatch of his command vehicle, looking up at the swirling purple energy forming the gravitic anomalies. He raised his right hand, extending his own psychic aura outward to intersect the incoming warp phenomena. The golden light radiating from his auramite armor intensified, cutting through the heavy rain and projecting a solid dome of kinetic force over his advancing troops. The golden dome collided with the purple gravitic distortions, creating loud, echoing cracks of static discharge that shattered the glass lenses on the soldiers' rebreather masks. The Emperor maintained the structural integrity of the psychic shield, nullifying the gravitational pressure and allowing the Thunder Warriors to resume their march toward the steel walls. Caligan observed the psychic deflection through his bunker monitors. He ordered the deployment of his heavy infantry reserves. Thousands of Ursh soldiers charged out from the fortress gates, wielding long carbon fiber spears tipped with highly venomous biological agents. They threw themselves against the Thunder Warrior lines, driving their spears toward the flexible joint seals of the power armor. The venom melted through the rubberized gaskets, injecting toxic neuroagents directly into the super soldiers' bloodstreams. Several Thunder Warriors fell to their knees, their muscles seizing uncontrollably as the venom shut down their nervous systems. The surviving super soldiers retaliated with extreme physical violence. They grabbed the Ursh soldiers by their carbon fiber spears, pulling them close, and crushed their skulls with their heavy, armored gauntlets. The custodian guard advanced directly behind the Thunder Warrior vanguard. They utilized the massed bodies of the super soldiers as moving cover, stepping through the gaps in the front line to engage the heaviest concentrations of Ursh infantry. The custodians fired the integrated bolters on their guardian spears, sending armor-piercing rounds through the chests of the enemy commanders. They maintained perfect cohesion, rotating their firing lines to cover all angles of the chaotic melee. The disciplined bolter fire from the custodians, combined with the brutal close-quarters slaughter executed by the Thunder Warriors, broke the momentum of the Ursh charge. The remaining enemy infantry retreated toward the heavy steel walls, slipping in the mud and leaving their venom-tipped spears behind. The Emperor ordered the Geno 5-2 Chiliad to bring their heavy siege mortars to the front line. The mortal soldiers established firing platforms in the mud, locking the heavy brass barrels into place. They loaded concentrated promethium shells into the mortars and fired high-arcing volleys over the steel walls of the fortress. The shells impacted the central courtyards, detonating and covering the Ursh defenders in burning, sticky liquid fire. The flames spread rapidly, consuming the wooden support structures of the inner citadel and creating thick plumes of black smoke. The Emperor signaled the final push. The Thunder Warriors charged the main gates, setting heavy melter charges against the steel hinges and blowing the massive doors inward. The super soldiers flooded into the burning fortress, their chainswords roaring as they cut down the remaining defenders. The Emperor walked through the shattered gates, his golden armor reflecting the light of the burning promethium. He bypassed the fighting in the courtyard and proceeded directly down the main corridor leading to Caligan's command bunker. The heavy steel door of the bunker lay warped and buckled from the extreme heat. The Emperor gripped the edges of the door with both hands and pulled outward, tearing the metal from the reinforced concrete frame. He stepped inside the bunker, finding the massive warlord slumped over his command console, his grav suspensor rig failing and his body crushed under its own engineered weight. He did not offer terms of integration to the warlord of Ursh. He raised his bolter pistol and fired a single mass-reactive round directly into the back of Caligan's head. The explosive force destroyed the tyrant's skull and scattered brain tissue across the brass monitors. The Emperor turned away from the console and walked back out into the rain. He directed his forces to secure the armories and eliminate the surviving rogue psychers. With the brutal subjugation of Ursh complete, the Emperor looked toward the final unconquered regions of the planet, preparing to consolidate his complete authority over the remaining isolated holdouts. The heavy transport crawlers rotated their iron treads, crossing the equator into the flooded, high-humidity archipelagos of the Indonesic bloc. The geography consisted of dense, overgrown tropical flora, deep saltwater swamps, and high atmospheric moisture. Vines thick as a man's arm wrapped around the rusted hulls of ancient seafaring vessels stranded in the muck. Cardinal Tang occupied a towering ziggurat of polished black basalt at the center of the largest island. Tang managed a strict biological caste system across his population by confining millions of humans inside massive genetic internment camps. Tall iron poles and electrified razor wire surrounded these enclosures. Arc-lumen floodlights mounted on ferrocrete watchtowers swept harsh white beams across the mud fields below, tracking the movements of the captive population. Tang's soldiers marched along the perimeters wearing identical grey synthetic uniforms. They possessed completely shaved heads, identical cranial measurements, and sequential black barcodes tattooed directly across their foreheads. They carried suppressed autoguns, holding the black metal rifles tightly against their chests. They patrolled the camps in perfectly synchronized formations, their heavy boots striking the metal catwalks in precise rhythm. The heavy humidity caused condensation to bead along the barrels of their weapons and drip onto the steel grating. The Thunder Warriors marched into the deep saltwater swamps, their heavy iron armor sinking up to the knee joints in the thick black mud. The genetic soldiers of the Indonesic bloc fired their suppressed autoguns from the watchtowers, sending streams of solid slug ammunition striking the overlapping ceramite plates of the super soldiers. Sparks flew into the damp air as the bullets chipped the grey paint. The Thunder Warriors raised their heavy volkite charges and pulled the firing triggers. The concentrated thermal beams lanced across the swamps, instantly boiling the salt water in their path and striking the iron watchtowers. The intense heat melted the ferrocrete supports, collapsing the towers and incinerating the genetically uniform soldiers inside. The super soldiers waded out of the swamps, grabbed the electrified razor wire with their heavy gauntlets, and pulled the barricades out of the mud. They tore the perimeter fences apart through sheer mechanical torque, bending the thick iron poles and snapping the sparking cables. The Emperor dispatched a tight formation of custodian guards to infiltrate Cardinal Tang's black basalt ziggurat. The golden-armored warriors ascended the steep stone steps, driving the crackling power blades of their guardian spears through the torsos of Tang's elite bodyguards. The blades cauterized the wounds instantly, leaving the guards to tumble down the stone stairs. The custodians breached the central command chamber, shattering the heavy wooden doors into splinters. Cardinal Tang sat on a high platform, his frail body hooked into heavy brass blood filtration machines via transparent plastic tubes. He wore long crimson robes over his emaciated frame. The custodian guards stepped forward, severing the filtration tubes with their combat knives and clamping heavy iron shackles around Tang's thin wrists. They dragged the tyrant out of his ziggurat, hauling him down the stone steps and throwing him into the back of an armored transport crawler to face permanent penal servitude in the deep tectonic labor camps. Following the subjugation of the Indonesic archipelagos, the Emperor directed his massive military columns toward the mineral-rich, jagged peaks of the Caucasus wastes. The ruler of this territory, known as the Ethnarch, controlled a vast network of subterranean armories and high-altitude defensive batteries. The Ethnarch projected massive kinetic force fields over his mountain fortresses. These shields manifested as interlocking blue hexagons of concentrated energy, humming loudly and displacing the atmospheric dust around them. The Thunder Warriors fired their heavy artillery cannons from the valley floors, sending high-explosive shells arcing toward the peaks. The shells struck the blue hexagons, detonating against the energy barriers and showering the surrounding rock with fragmented iron shrapnel. Observing the structural integrity of the kinetic shields, the Emperor issued orders to the mortal soldiers of the Geno 52 Chiliad. The grey-coated infantry deployed heavy subterranean drilling machines, equipped with massive diamond-tipped cutting heads. The machines engaged their rotary engines, grinding directly into the granite bedrock at the base of the mountains. The drills carved wide circular tunnels straight upward through the stone, bypassing the projected energy fields resting above the surface. The Thunder Warriors marched into the freshly bored tunnels, ascending the steep inclines and emerging directly inside the Ethnarch's primary courtyard. The Thunder Warriors activated the motors of their heavy chainswords inside the fortress walls. The Ethnarch's cybernetic garrison turned their weapons inward, firing plasma projectors at the invading super soldiers. The Thunder Warriors closed the distance rapidly, swinging their chainswords in wide, continuous arcs. The steel teeth chewed through the cybernetic limbs and reinforced chest plates of the defenders, spraying machine oil and dark blood across the stone courtyard. The super soldiers smashed the brass power couplings of the shield generators with their heavy iron boots, collapsing the blue hexagonal barriers and exposing the fortress to the sky. The emperor walked up the mountain path and stepped through the ruined gates of the Caucasus fortress. He looked across the courtyard, filled with severed cybernetic limbs and the heavily damaged bodies of his own thunder warriors. He processed the rapidly accelerating biological decay affecting the massive super soldiers, noting the increasing frequency of their cellular breakdowns and internal hemorrhaging. He turned his focus back toward the deep gene vaults of the Himalayan mountains, preparing to initiate the mass deployment of his newly stabilized, grey-armored proto-Astartes to execute the final pacification of the remaining terrestrial holds. The central staging grounds of the Himalayan fortress vibrated as tens of thousands of grey-armored proto-Astartes marched in perfect, locked-step formations. These warriors stood slightly shorter than the hulking thunder warriors, but their movements lacked the erratic, twitching aggression caused by unstable cellular degradation. The proto-Astartes turned in unison, tracking targets on the firing range, and discharged their standardized bolter rifles. The mass-reactive shells struck the iron targets within millimeters of each other, demonstrating an integrated neurological discipline the older super soldiers could never achieve. The emperor stood on the high battlements, observing the grey legions. He noted their steady heart rates, stable endocrine functions, and the complete absence of internal hemorrhaging. He walked down the stone stairs to the heavy transport crawlers, directing the deployment of these stable forces alongside the brutal, dying ranks of the Thunder Warriors to secure the final independent territories of Terra. The combined armies rolled out toward the massive, heavily fortified hive cities of the Indonesic bloc's neighboring sectors, crossing into the toxic deserts of the American continent. The warlords of America controlled deep subterranean bunkers filled with highly advanced colonial-era weaponry. They deployed tracked artillery batteries that fired solid slug shells the size of transport shuttles. The Emperor's forces advanced through the blast craters. The Thunder Warriors charged directly into the artillery fire, their heavy iron armor shattering under the massive kinetic impacts, taking heavy casualties to break the outer defensive rings. Once the perimeter fell, the Proto-Astartes moved into the breach. They utilized perfectly synchronized bounding overwatch maneuvers, providing continuous covering fire while advancing from crater to crater, clearing the heavy bunkers with short, controlled bursts of bolter fire and fragmentation grenades. Following the subjugation of the American warlords, the armies pushed eastward into the rugged, irradiated mountains of the Frank Empire. The Franks fought from highly defensible mountain passes, utilizing acoustic weapons that projected concentrated sonic waves. The high-frequency vibrations shattered the glass optical lenses of the advancing infantry and ruptured the internal organs of the Thunder Warriors, exacerbating their existing biological instability. The Emperor countered the acoustic barrages by directing the Geno 52 Chiliad to deploy heavy sonic dampeners. The mortal soldiers pushed the massive brass resonance engines up the steep mountain paths, cancelling the enemy frequencies. The Proto-Astartes then engaged in systematic mountain clearance, utilizing grappling cables to scale the rock faces and dropping melter charges directly down the exhaust vents of the Frank defensive batteries. The final major campaign centered on the deeply entrenched techno-theocracy of the Boeotian domain. The Boeotians utilized massive, walking mechanical constructs, early precursors to dreadnought technology, armed with twin-linked plasma projectors. These towering iron machines stepped across the battlefield, evaporating entire squads of Thunder Warriors with sweeping beams of superheated plasma. The Emperor commanded the Inferalti Hussars to flank the mechanical constructs, The cavalry units drove their heavy equines through the ruins, striking the unprotected knee joints of the walking machines with their thermal lances. As the constructs collapsed into the dirt, the proto-Astartes swarmed the fallen iron chassis, driving their combat knives through the viewing slits and terminating the human pilots inside. The Boeotian leaders recognized the systematic dismantling of their military assets. They observed the sheer numbers and unbreakable discipline of the grey-armored legions surrounding their capital. The leaders opened the heavy blast doors of their central citadel, walking out onto the ash-covered plains and throwing their weapons onto the ground. The emperor accepted their surrender, completely securing the European landmass and achieving nominal control over the entire planetary surface. He established permanent garrisons in the conquered territories, assigning the proto-Astartes to maintain martial law, while his logistical teams began harvesting the global resources required for his ultimate objective. He returned to the Himalaysian fortress, analyzing the combat data recorded during the final campaigns. He observed the steep decline in the combat effectiveness of the Thunder Warriors. Thousands of the massive super soldiers had perished from enemy fire, and thousands more had collapsed on the battlefields, their bodies tearing themselves apart from rapid cellular degradation and massive organ failure. The survivors exhibited extreme psychological instability, their engineered aggression turning inward as their physical forms failed. The emperor looked at the stable, disciplined ranks of the proto-Astartes, calculating their long-term operational viability. He determined the Thunder Warriors had fulfilled their singular purpose of brutal planetary conquest, and their unstable, violent nature now posed a direct threat to the stabilized order of his unified world. He initiated the final phase of his terrestrial consolidation. He issued encrypted Vox commands to the Custodian Guard and the Proto-Astartes, outlining the exact coordinates of a massive geographical formation known as Mount Ararat. He ordered the remaining Thunder Warriors to assemble at this location, stating they were to eliminate a final stubborn pocket of techno-barbarian resistance. The massive, dying super soldiers boarded the heavy transport crawlers, their chainswords revving as they prepared for another slaughter. The emperor marched alongside them, bringing the entire strength of his newly formed legions to the rocky slopes of Mount Ararat, preparing to close the final chapter of the Unification Wars and sever the last remnant of the brutal age that had birthed his empire. Heavy rain washed over the steep volcanic rock of Mount Ararat, carving deep runnels through the grey ash covering the slopes. The peak of the mountain stood hidden behind a thick layer of acidic clouds, while the lower valleys housed a dense network of interlocking ferrocrete trenches and heavy iron blast shields. This complex served as the final stronghold of the Urartu Enclave, a heavily fortified techno-barbarian faction that refused the emperor's terms of integration. The Urartu defenders manned heavy plasma projectors along the trench lines, rotating the brass barrels to track the massing armies below. Thousands of remaining Thunder Warriors marched toward the mountain, their iron armor stained with the dried blood and chemical runoff of 100 previous campaigns. The super soldiers moved with erratic, twitching steps, their bodies breaking down rapidly from cellular exhaustion and hormonal overload. Dark fluid leaked from the exhaust vents of their power packs, and the motors of their heavy chainswords sputtered under the strain of continuous use. The emperor stood inside his golden command vehicle at the base of the mountain, surrounded by the disciplined, grey-armored ranks of the Proto-Astartes. He observed the Thunder Warriors advancing up the steep incline, directly into the firing arcs of the Urartu plasma projectors. The defenders opened fire, sending streams of superheated blue plasma cutting through the freezing rain. The concentrated thermal energy struck the Thunder Warriors, melting their iron chest plates and instantly vaporizing the dense muscle tissue beneath. The super soldiers did not break their formation or attempt to seek cover. Their engineered aggression pushed them forward into the lethal crossfire. They fired their Volkite charges continuously, trading heavy casualties to secure the first line of ferrocrete trenches. The super soldiers jumped down into the defensive ditches, swinging their chainswords with brutal, uncoordinated strikes, crushing the Urartu infantry in close-quarters combat, while suffering massive internal hemorrhaging. As the Thunder Warriors pushed deeper into the trench network, the Urartu warlords detonated concealed fragmentation mines buried beneath the rocky soil. The explosions threw massive chunks of jagged granite and twisted iron shrapnel through the air, tearing off the limbs of the super soldiers and collapsing the trench walls. The Thunder Warriors absorbed the devastating damage, their broken bodies pressing forward up the mountain out of pure, hormonal momentum. The Emperor tracked the casualty rates on his brass chronometers. He watched the numerical representations of the Thunder Warrior legions plummet, the thousands of green markers flashing red and disappearing from the screens as the super soldiers bled out in the mud or evaporated under plasma fire. The Emperor deployed the Proto-Astartes regiments to flank the mountain, sending the grey-armoured warriors up the steeper, less fortified eastern slopes. The Proto-Astartes moved in synchronized formations, utilizing grappling hooks to scale the sheer rock faces and planting focused melter charges against the secondary bunker doors. They cleared the upper levels of the Urartu stronghold with disciplined bolter fire, executing precise tactical maneuvers to secure the heavy anti-aircraft batteries positioned near the peak. Below them, the Thunder Warriors ground through the primary defensive lines, leaving thousands of their own dead stacked inside the trenches. The brutal melee exterminated the remaining Urartu forces, breaking the back of the final independent warlord faction on Terra. The Emperor walked up the blood-soaked slopes of Mount Ararat, his golden custodian guards forming a tight perimeter around his command vehicle. He stood at the edge of the primary trench network, looking down at the scattered survivors of the Thunder Warrior legions. Less than a few hundred super soldiers remained standing. Their iron armor hung in shattered pieces, exposing the raw, genetically manipulated flesh underneath. They breathed in heavy, ragged gasps, their mutated lungs struggling to process oxygen through the thick volcanic ash. Many dropped to their knees, their internal organs finally rupturing after years of hyper-accelerated combat stress. They clutched their chest plates, vomiting dark blood onto the rocks as their cellular structure collapsed. The Emperor recognized the finality of their biological degradation. The super soldiers possessed no capacity for integration into a stable, unified society. Their minds harbored only the instinct for total violence, and their bodies were ticking biological time bombs. He raised his hand, signaling the custodian guard and the Proto-Astartes regiments positioned above the trenches. The Golden Warriors and the grey-armoured soldiers stepped forward, raising their guardian spears and bolter rifles. They aimed their weapons directly down into the trench network, targeting the exhausted, dying survivors of the Thunder Warrior legions. The Emperor gave the final execution order. The custodians and Proto-Astartes opened fire simultaneously, sending thousands of mass-reactive rounds and concentrated bolter shells tearing into the trenches. The Thunder Warriors, too broken and degraded to mount a defense, were cut down where they stood. The explosive munitions shredded their remaining armor and pulverized their heavy skeletal structures, ending their genetic agony. The Emperor watched the final super soldier collapse into the mud, his chest cavity hollowed out by bolter fire. He turned away from the trench, his facial expression completely neutral, and walked back down the mountain. He recorded the incident in his official ledgers as a heroic final stand, claiming the Thunder Warriors died to a man securing the victory at Mount Ararat. He sealed the truth behind a wall of engineered propaganda, preparing to shift his entire focus from the conquered surface of Terra to the massive orbital shipyards required to reach the stars. Heavy industrial earth movers stripped the remaining snow and topsoil from the peaks of the Himalayan mountains. The machines dug massive diamond-tipped treads into the exposed granite, carving wide, flat plateaus miles above the polluted clouds. Millions of unaugmented human laborers poured wet ferrocrete into deep foundation trenches, reinforcing the walls with thick grids of woven titanium rebar. The Emperor directed the construction of his central seat of power, laying the physical groundwork for the imperial palace. Huge transport flyers dropped prefabricated steel habblocks onto the cleared ledges, assembling barracks and administration sectors piece by piece. Cranes the size of hive spires lowered heavy brass orbital defense batteries onto fortified plinths, bolting the massive cannons directly into the bedrock. The air filled with the continuous sound of grinding stone, the sharp smell of curing concrete, and the heavy exhaust of industrial plasma engines. Deep below the shifting surface of the mountains, the genetic laboratories operated at maximum capacity. The Emperor deactivated the crude incubation vats previously used for the Thunder Warriors. He initiated the mass production of the stabilized Proto-Astartes templates, forging them into the definitive Legiones Astartes. Automated surgical rigs implanted the human subjects with 19 specialized organ clusters. Ceramic-bonded rib cages fused into solid bulletproof shields over their enlarged hearts and multi-lung systems. The technicians fed the subjects hypercaloric nutrient pastes, rapidly increasing their bone density and muscle mass. These new warriors stood slightly shorter than the extinct Thunder Warriors and possessed absolute cellular stability. Their telomeres locked into permanent, sustainable lengths, granting them functional biological immortality. The apothecaries extracted blood samples from the subjects, checking the hormone balances and logging the perfect integration of the synthetic genetic material into their primary organs. The foundries of the Terra clan worked continuously to arm these expanding legions. Conveyor lines delivered thousands of Mark II Crusade power armor suits to the arming chambers. The armor featured overlapping plates of heavy ceramite bonded with plasteel, incorporating full environmental sealing, localized void-hardened life support systems, and integrated autosenses within the heavy helmets. The warriors locked the armor pieces over the black synthetic body gloves, covering their skin. They armed themselves with newly fabricated Phobos pattern bolters, heavy chainswords, and dense combat blades. The newly formed legions applied specific chemical pigments to their ceramite, covering the bare gray base layers with stark colors. They painted their armor in deep crimson, sea green, dark iron, and brilliant gold, displaying the exact heraldry and numerical designations assigned by the Emperor. The armories echoed with the sound of bolters racking heavy shells into the firing chambers, and the heavy thud of ceramite boots stepping onto the steel grating. The Emperor structured the mortal populations to support his military expansion. Scribes sat at long wooden desks inside the lower levels of the palace, dipping metal quills into black ink and recording the planetary census across millions of parchment scrolls. The surviving human infantry regiments from the Unification campaigns consolidated into the Imperialis Auxilia, the Geno 52 Chiliad, and the Inferalti Hussars stood alongside hundreds of newly recruited divisions from the pacified territories of Merica, Albia, and Ursh. They wore standardized flak armor, layered over heavy cotton fatigues, and carried mass-produced lasguns. Supply trains loaded millions of tons of preserved rations, medical supplies, and promethium fuel into heavily armored transport columns staging at the mountain bases. The logistics networks pumped resources from the deep ocean processing plants directly to the high-altitude landing pads, filling the fuel silos of the waiting dropships. At the highest peak of the newly constructed palace, the emperor laid the foundation for a massive psychic broadcasting array. Workers installed thousands of conductive copper coils and heavy psychic resonator dishes inside a towering spherical chamber. The emperor stepped into the center of the array, projecting a fraction of his dense psychic energy into the metal conduits. A beam of concentrated golden light shot straight upward, piercing the dense smog layer and passing through the upper atmosphere. The light hit the edge of the immaterium, creating a stable, glowing beacon within the turbulent currents of the warp. He calibrated the beacon to guide warp-capable transport vessels through the Empyrean, preparing the infrastructure for interstellar transit. The heavy brass machines humming around the chamber stabilized the energy flow, locking the golden beam onto a permanent outward trajectory into the dark void. He stood on the primary observation deck of the High Palace, looking up through the reinforced armor-glass windows. He observed the massive, pale sphere of Terra's moon suspended in the night sky. The satellite featured massive, artificial ring structures and deep, illuminated craters visible from the planetary surface. These orbital fortifications housed the Selenar gene cults, human scientists holding heavily guarded biotechnological facilities and zero-gravity shipyards. The Emperor calculated the fuel reserves required to launch his heavy assault shuttles out of the planetary gravity well. He dispatched orders to the newly armored Space Marine legions, directing them to board the waiting drop pods and deep void transport ships. He prepared to extend his military authority beyond the atmosphere of Terra, moving to secure the lunar bases and take absolute control over the orbital space above his unified world. Heavy assault shuttles ignited their primary plasma thrusters on the high-altitude landing pads of the Himalaysian fortress. The engines expelled columns of superheated blue exhaust, pushing the thick iron hulls upward through the dense smog layer. The shuttles carried thousands of gray-armored space marines strapped into heavy crash webbing. The void-hardened ceramite plates of their Mark II Crusade armor engaged mechanical environmental seals, locking the atmospheric pressure inside their suits and activating internal oxygen cyclers. The shuttles pierced the upper stratosphere, entering the absolute cold vacuum of space. They rotated their orientation thrusters, aligning their adamantium prows, and accelerated directly toward the heavily cratered surface of Luna. Inside the troop compartments, the Space Marines held their bolters across their chests, monitoring the scrolling green runes inside their helmet visors, indicating optimal fluid pressure and localized gravity adjustments. The Selenar gene cults monitored the incoming transport vessels from their orbital defense stations. The Selenar possessed extensively modified biological forms, utilizing spliced genetic material from varied species. Technicians walked on segmented, insectoid limbs to navigate the microgravity environments, possessing elongated spinal columns and translucent scales covering their torsos. They breathed through external filtration gills and operated heavy defense lasers arrayed along the artificial ring structures spanning the major craters. The laser capacitors whined as they charged, firing concentrated beams of ruby light through the vacuum. The beams struck the leading assault shuttles, melting through their adamantium hulls and vaporizing the interior bulkheads. The molten metal cooled into jagged floating droplets in the void, sending the ruptured vessels spinning off course to crash violently into the grey dust of the lunar surface. The surviving shuttles fired reverse thrusters and smashed their spiked boarding ramps directly into the ferrocrete domes of the Selenar Gene Labs. The impact shattered the outer domes, venting atmosphere out into the void. The ramps deployed, and the Space Marines charged into the pressurized corridors of the underlying structures. They activated the magnetic clamps built into the soles of their ceramite boots, anchoring their frames to the steel grating of the floor in the microgravity sections. The soldiers of the newly formed 16th Legion led the primary assault, their armor painted a stark, pale gray. They leveled their Phobos pattern bolters and fired at the defending Selenar bio-warriors. The mass-reactive shells struck the heavily modified combatants, detonating inside their engineered muscle masses and spraying dark, frozen blood across the polished silver walls of the laboratories. The gene cult defenders released vat-grown monstrosities into the main transit arteries of the lunar base. These creatures possessed thick, chitinous armor plating, elongated scythe-like appendages tipped with venomous barbs, and multiple optical sensors running along their spines. The monstrosities charged down the tight corridors, digging their claws into the metal walls and swinging their biological scythes into the front ranks of the 16th Legion. The sharp chitin sliced through the ceramite shoulder pads, severing the internal copper power cables of the Space Marines' armor and spilling synthetic lubricants onto the floor. The Astartes adjusted their firing lines, directing concentrated bolter fire at the exposed joint articulations of the massive creatures. The explosive shells shattered the chitin plating, blowing the creatures apart and leaving heaps of twitching biological matter blocking the passageways. The Space Marines advanced over the biological debris, pushing deeper into the central incubation vaults of the Selenar. The heavy bolter fire shattered the reinforced glass walls of the pressurized aquatic environments, causing immediate, explosive decompression. The water and oxygen rushed out of the chambers, carrying the torn bodies of the gene cult defenders and half-formed biological specimens into the vacuum of the lunar surface. The void-hardened armor of the Astartes maintained their internal oxygen supplies and thermal heat regulation systems. They marched through the evacuated vaults, relying entirely on specialized tactical hand signals and internal vox beads to coordinate their movements and sweep the remaining defensive emplacements. They planted melter charges against the heavy titanium blast doors leading to the Matriarch's command center, detonating the explosives and melting the thick locking mechanisms into pools of glowing, zero-gravity slag. The Emperor walked out of a specialized golden transport shuttle onto the lunar surface, his auramite armor catching the harsh, direct light of the distant sun. He stepped through the ruined airlocks, moving past the floating debris, and entered the breached command center, walking past the armed ranks of the 16th Legion. The matriarchs of the Selenar gene cults stood at the center of the chamber, surrounded by rows of brass data cogitators filled with tens of thousands of years of stored genetic research data. The matriarchs scanned the biotelemetry streaming from the Astartes armor, observing the locked telomeres, the redundant organ systems, and the flawless cellular regeneration of the soldiers securing the room. The matriarchs powered down their remaining defense grids and handed over the heavy iron access keys to their central biological repositories, submitting their entire cult to the Emperor's physical authority. The Emperor integrated the Selenar gene forges directly with his terrestrial laboratories. Technicians pumped raw genetic fluid through massive orbital transport shuttles to accelerate the incubation of new warriors. The massive vats of Luna provided the exact industrial capacity required to scale the production of the Space Marine legions to a galactic level. The combined methodologies of the terrestrial and lunar scientists rapidly accelerated the creation of thousands of new Astartes every solar cycle, filling the staging grounds with fully armored super soldiers. He renamed the 16th Legion the Lunar Wolves, ordering his artisans to paint the emblem of a stylized wolf head across their pale grey armor. He walked back to his transport shuttle, projecting the tactical schematics for the remaining planetary bodies within the Sol system across his monitors. He directed the expanding fleets of newly constructed void ships to ignite their plasma drives and set coordinates for the red, oxidized deserts of Mars. Heavy construction shuttles detached from the lunar shipyards, their plasma thrusters glowing blue against the dark vacuum of space. They hauled massive sections of prefabricated orbital scaffolding, locking the titanium girders together around the perimeter of Terra's moon. The Selenar technicians floated along the framework using magnetic boots, welding heavy adamantium armor plates to the exterior of the newly formed Imperial fleet. These void ships possessed dense, armored prows designed specifically to ram through hostile blockades, and heavy macro-cannon batteries lined their broadsides. The Emperor directed the loading operations from the Lunar Command Center. He watched thousands of transport shuttles ferry the grey-armored Space Marines, the Imperialis Auxilia regiments, and millions of tons of processed promethium fuel from the surface of Terra directly into the cargo bays of the waiting warships. When the fleet reached optimum operational capacity, the Emperor ordered the ships to break orbit. The massive plasma drives ignited, pushing the heavy vessels through the frictionless void. They accelerated away from Terra, crossing the vast, silent distance toward the red, oxidized sphere of Mars. As the fleet approached the Martian orbit, the tactical sensors inside the Imperial command ship detected massive rings of orbital defense platforms encircling the planet. These platforms bristled with heavy neutron lasers and guided plasma torpedo launchers. Below the orbital defenses, the surface of Mars displayed vast networks of towering red iron forge cities, connected by deep trenches cut directly into the rusty bedrock. Millions of cybernetically augmented humans populated these cities, replacing their biological limbs with heavy steel pistons and grafting brass cogitators directly into their skulls. They worshipped machines as divine entities, functioning as a massive, planet-wide, techno-religious cult known as the Mechanicum. The Emperor did not order his fleet to open fire. He instructed his helmsman to position his golden command ship directly ahead of the fleet, leaving the weapon batteries completely unpowered. He broadcast a completely unencrypted communication signal across all Mechanicum frequencies. He requested a direct parley with the Fabricator General, the absolute ruler of the Martian cult. He offered them full autonomy over their religious practices and complete operational control of their forged cities. In exchange, he required their total industrial output, their advanced void ship schematics, and their massive armies of heavy, bipedal combat walkers, known as Titans, to supply his expanding crusade. The Fabricator General processed the communication through his heavy brass logic engines. He observed the massive Imperial fleet holding position just outside the firing range of his orbital lasers. He analyzed the unpowered weapons of the Emperor's command ship, noting the sheer confidence of the gesture. He transmitted an acceptance code back to the Imperial fleet, deactivating a specific section of the orbital defense ring and opening a clear flight path down to the Martian surface. The Golden Command ship descended through the thin red atmosphere, touching down on a massive ferrocrete landing pad at the base of Olympus Mons, the largest forge city on the planet. The Emperor walked down the landing ramp, stepping onto the red Martian dust. He wore his heavy oromite armor, but he left his crackling power sword sheathed at his hip. He walked into the massive central forge, surrounded by the towering heavy machinery of the Mechanicum. Thousands of cybernetic priests bowed their heads as he passed, their optical sensors struggling to process the intense golden light radiating from his physical form. He approached a massive, malfunctioning Imperial Night Titan resting on heavy support gantries. The massive war machine's core logic engine had suffered catastrophic failure, locking the heavy joints and shutting down the primary plasma reactor. The Emperor placed his bare hand against the thick iron plating of the Night Titan. He extended his psychic resonance into the machine's internal systems, instantly mapping the complex wiring, the damaged silicon processors, and the stalled fuel injectors. He projected a highly concentrated burst of kinetic energy, realigning the silicon processors and clearing the blockage in the fuel injectors simultaneously. The massive machine vibrated as the primary plasma reactor ignited, the heavy knee joints unlocking with a loud hiss of pressurized steam. The optical sensors of the Night Titan glowed with a bright blue light, indicating full operational capacity. The priests of the Mechanicum fell to their knees upon the metal grating. They witnessed a being who could heal the most complex machinery through simple physical contact. They declared him the physical manifestation of their machine god, the Omnissiah. The Fabricator General stepped forward, his massive, heavily augmented body moving on grinding tank treads. He presented the Emperor with a heavy iron scroll detailing the complete alliance between Terra and Mars. The Treaty of Olympus merged the massive industrial output of the Red Planet with the genetic perfection of the Emperor's Space Marine legions. The Emperor signed the Iron Scroll, securing the advanced technology and massive Titan legions necessary to push his crusade beyond the Sol system and out into the wider galaxy. With the Treaty of Olympus secured, the heavy industrial output of Mars flowed directly into the orbital shipyards above Terra. Millions of Mechanicum servitors, lobotomized humans wired directly into heavy machinery, worked alongside the Selenar technicians, rapidly assembling massive, mile-long void transports. The Emperor stood in the observation dome of his command ship, watching the newly constructed fleet form into a massive, organized armada. He directed the loading of his fully equipped Space Marine legions, watching thousands of heavy drop pods lock into their orbital deployment racks. The fleet broke away from the Sol system, activating their warp drives and tearing a physical hole through the fabric of real space. They plunged into the Empyrean, utilizing the psychic beacon projected from the Imperial Palace to navigate the churning currents of plasma, completely bypassing the massive distance between solar systems in a matter of weeks. The Imperial fleet exited the warp on the edge of the Segmentum Solar, targeting the scattered human colonies that had survived the Age of Strife in extreme isolation. They approached a terrestrial planet designated 63-19. The world featured sprawling, advanced agricultural domes and towering, pristine silver cities, completely untouched by the toxic devastation that had ruined Terra. The local human population had maintained their technological infrastructure, utilizing advanced atmospheric scrubbers and automated agricultural harvesters. A heavily armed planetary defense fleet launched from the surface to intercept the Emperor's ships. The local commanders demanded immediate withdrawal, stating they served their own sovereign ruler, a man they titled the Emperor of mankind. The true Emperor did not respond to the transmission. He ordered his fleet to advance. The Imperial warships fired their heavy macro cannons, sending massive, building-sized artillery shells through the void. The shells struck the smaller planetary defense vessels, shattering their kinetic shields and blowing their hulls into expanding clouds of frozen debris. The Golden Command ship pushed through the wreckage, breaking into the planet's atmosphere. The Emperor deployed the Lunar Wolves. Thousands of grey-armored space marines dropped from the sky in heavy iron pods, slamming into the pristine silver courtyards of the local capital city. The space marines burst from the pods, firing their Phobos bolters into the defending ranks of the local human infantry. The mass-reactive shells ripped through the light flak armor of the defenders, completely overwhelming their defensive lines within hours. The Lunar Wolves breached the central administration spire, securing the local ruler. The Emperor descended from his command ship and walked into the spire, looking at the man who had claimed his exact title. He did not execute the false ruler. Instead, he forced the man onto his knees before the gathered population of the Silver City, officially stripping him of his title and integrating the planet's advanced agricultural output into the Imperial logistics network. The Emperor left a small garrison of space marines behind and immediately returned to his fleet. He set the navigation coordinates for the next system, accelerating the pace of the Great Crusade, moving rapidly from world to world, subjugating isolated human civilizations and exterminating any Xenos species that occupied viable terrestrial planets. As the fleet pushed deeper into the galaxy, they encountered the psychic shockwaves radiating from a massive Orc empire centered on the Ulanor system. The Orcs possessed crude but devastating technology, constructing massive, heavily armored starships from fused scrap metal and looted human colonies. The Orc overlord, Urlak-Urg, commanded billions of heavily muscled, green-skinned warriors. The Emperor directed his entire armada toward Ulanor. The Imperial void ships engaged the massive Orc scrap fleet in close orbit, exchanging broadside macro cannon fire that illuminated the void with continuous explosions. The Emperor ordered a full-scale planetary drop. Tens of thousands of space marines from multiple legions deployed simultaneously, their drop pods raining down onto the heavy iron fortresses of the Orc Empire. The Emperor led the primary assault directly against Urlak-Urg's central fortress. He fought alongside the Lunar Wolves and his golden custodian guard, carving through the dense masses of Orc infantry. The Orcs fired heavy, crude solid slug weapons and swung massive powered axes, their thick biological resilience allowing them to continue fighting even after sustaining massive physical trauma. The Emperor projected his golden psychic aura across the battlefield, increasing the kinetic force of his sword strikes and blinding the optical sensors of the Orc heavy armor. He fought his way up the central iron tower, completely ignoring the heavy slug rounds bouncing off his auramite armor. He breached the upper command deck and confronted the Orc overlord. Urlak-Urg stood over twice the height of a space marine, clad in heavy riveted iron plates and gripping a massive motorized power claw. The Orc overlord charged, bringing the heavy claw down toward the Emperor's head. The Emperor sidestepped the massive blow, the heavy iron claw sparking against the metal deck. He raised his crackling power sword and drove it completely through the thick, green-skinned torso of the overlord, slicing upward through the ribcage and severing the creature's spinal column. The massive Orc collapsed, and the Emperor raised his bloody sword above the ruined command deck. The death of the overlord completely broke the psychic momentum of the Orc horde. the remaining greenskins scattered, pursued, and exterminated by the advancing lines of the Space Marine legions, securing the single largest victory of the Great Crusade. Following the absolute destruction of the Orc Empire at Ulanor, the Emperor ordered the construction of a massive, temporary iron pavilion across the flattened ruins of the enemy fortress. He summoned the commanders of his Space Marine legions and millions of Imperial Army soldiers to assemble on the scorched plains. He stood on a high central dais, his golden armor completely cleaned of Orc blood. He looked out across the massive, victorious military host that had secured a massive portion of the galaxy under his command. He prepared to issue a formal declaration, fundamentally altering the leadership structure of the Great Crusade, and preparing for his permanent return to the deep subterranean vaults beneath the Himalayan mountains of Terra. Millions of Imperial Army soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Space Marines stood in perfect, gridlocked formations across the scorched dirt of the Ulanor plains. The grey ash of the destroyed Orc Empire settled over the polished ceramite of their armor. White banners depicting a black wolf head snapped back and forth in the atmospheric currents. The Emperor stood atop a high platform constructed from fused black iron and the melted chassis of enemy tanks. 9 towering figures stood behind him. These men possessed physical dimensions exceeding standard Astartes by several feet, wearing customized, heavily articulated power armor. They were the Primarchs, the cloned genetic progenitors of the Space Marine legions. Sanguinius stood with large, white avian wings folded against his back. Rogel Dawn wore solid, bare gold plating. Mortarion breathed through a heavy, toxic filtration mask. Horus, the commander of the Lunar Wolves, stood closest to the Emperor. He wore thick plates of pale grey and gold ceramite, and a massive pelt of white fur draped over his broad shoulders. The Emperor projected his psychic resonance through the heavy brass vox amplifiers surrounding the platform. He transmitted his vocalizations across the entire valley, ensuring the acoustic waves reached the auditory sensors of every assembled soldier. He spoke the exact words, designating Horus as the War Master. He handed Horus a heavy, gold-chased baton, physically placing the command of the thousands of expeditionary fleets and millions of ground troops directly into his hands. The Emperor raised Horus's right arm into the air, presenting the newly appointed War Master to the gathered legions. The assembled Space Marines struck their armored gauntlets against their breastplates, creating a synchronized, deafening metallic crash that echoed off the surrounding mountain ridges. Horus bowed his head, lowering his optical sensors to the iron decking of the platform, and accepted the heavy mantle. The Emperor turned his back to the gathered host. He walked down the metal stairs of the platform and ascended the boarding ramp of his golden command vessel. The heavy adamantium doors slid shut behind him, locking the pressurized seals. The primary plasma thrusters ignited, searing the dirt of the pavilion and pushing the massive ship straight up through the thick atmosphere. The golden vessel broke orbit, leaving the vast fleet behind, and entered the Immaterium on a direct course back to the Sol system. The golden ship exited the warp currents and descended through the atmospheric layers of Terra, touching down on the high ferrocrete landing pads of the Himalayan palace. The Emperor immediately walked to the industrial transit elevators. The heavy iron cage lowered him miles deep into the continental bedrock, descending past the administration sectors and the military barracks. The elevator halted at the lowest excavated level of the Imperial complex. He walked out into a massive, heavily shielded cavern. 100-foot thick adamantium blast doors sealed the perimeter, guarded by phalanxes of custodian guard, gripping their heavy guardian spears. Mechanicum artisans crawled over a towering structure of brass, gold, and dark iron, positioned at the center of the subterranean vault. Thick bundles of braided copper cabling and coolant pipes spilled from the back of the structure, connecting directly to massive geothermal turbine engines buried deeper in the planetary crust. The technicians welded thick crystalline conduits along the floor, routing raw power into a large mechanical seat mounted at the top of the central machine. They utilized plasma torches and heavy hydraulic wrenches to lock the final power couplings into place, filling the air with the sharp scent of ozone and heated metal. The Emperor approached this central seat, designated as the Golden Throne. He inspected the heavy psychic amplifiers and cerebral interface nodes built into the headrest. The machine functioned as a massive, localized psychic magnification engine. He utilized the physical device to focus his psychic energy and pierce the dimensional barrier, separating real space from the webway. The webway existed as a stabilized, parallel tunnel network woven through the turbulent plasma of the warp, constructed millions of years prior by the ancient Eldari species. He intended to map these stable conduits, physically linking the distant human colonies through secure, shielded tunnels. This system bypassed the hazardous kinetic currents of the immaterium completely, tying the entire galactic empire together through physical pathways. The Emperor ascended the heavy brass steps and sat down upon the massive mechanical throne. Mechanicum servitors approached him with heavy cables, locking thick neural shunts directly into the connection ports embedded in the back of the throne. He gripped the iron armrests and closed his eyes. The geothermal turbines spun to maximum rotation, sending massive surges of electrical power through the crystalline conduits. The gold and brass machinery around him vibrated heavily, glowing with intense heat. The Emperor concentrated his psychic mass, driving a focused beam of kinetic force directly into the dimensional fabric. The space in front of the throne fractured, splitting the air and revealing a dark, glass-like tunnel stretching forward into the deep dimensions of the warp. As the shimmering portal stabilized, the Emperor signaled the specialized labor forces waiting at the edges of the cavern. Thousands of Mechanicum servitors marched forward, their heavy tracked lower bodies grinding against the stone floor. They carried thick slabs of psychically warded adamantium and massive spools of copper cabling. The servitors stepped through the fractured tier in reality, entering the dark, glass-like tunnels of the Eldari webway. They began welding the adamantium slabs directly to the ancient wraithbone structures, constructing a secure, human-engineered causeway branching off the main path. The Emperor remained seated upon the golden throne, beads of sweat forming across his forehead as he pushed massive quantities of bioelectric energy through the amplifiers to hold the dimensional tear open, focusing his entire physical capacity on the expansion of this secret causeway. The heavy blast doors of the subterranean vault slid shut, locking out the noise of the active geothermal turbines. Inside the warded chamber, the Emperor adjusted the dials on a massive bronze chronometer. The heavy metal casing of the chronometer hummed as the internal logic engines calculated complex spatial coordinates. He walked over to a series of thick armor-glass stasis pods lining the walls. 20 pods stood in a perfect circle around the room. Inside each pod rested a developing biological specimen. These specimens were the Primarchs, genetically engineered from his own modified DNA to command the 20 Space Marine legions. He pumped concentrated amniotic fluids into the pods through thick, transparent tubes. He adjusted the hormonal balances and neural growth accelerators for each specimen, He grafted specialized biological traits into their developing forms, designing some for extreme physical resilience and others for advanced tactical cognition. The fluid inside the pods bubbled as the massive infants grew rapidly, their bodies adapting to the highly concentrated nutrients. A sudden, sharp drop in barometric pressure filled the cavern. The thick, adamantium blast doors buckled inward, the metal groaning under immense external force. The Emperor turned away from the stasis pods and reached for his power sword resting on the nearby iron table. Before he could grasp the hilt, a massive tear opened directly in the center of the vault. The air shattered like brittle glass, exposing the churning, multicolored plasma of the warp. A massive wave of kinetic psychic energy blasted outward from the portal, throwing the heavy brass machinery against the stone walls. 4 distinct psychic presences poured through the rift, manifesting as dense clouds of boiling blood, writhing shadows, putrid green fog, and blinding pink light. These entities were the ruinous powers, the massive warp predators that had observed his consolidation of Terra. The 4 entities extended jagged tendrils of concentrated kinetic force, wrapping them around the 20 stasis pods. The thick armor glass cracked under the psychic pressure. The Emperor projected a massive golden kinetic shield over the pods, attempting to sever the warp tendrils. He drove concentrated blasts of golden psychic energy into the writhing shadows, incinerating the edges of the dark clouds. The 4 entities shifted their mass, merging their combined psychic weight to crush his golden shield. The heavy adamantium floor cracked beneath his boots as he absorbed the immense physical strain of the psychic assault. The entities pulled the 20 stasis pods into the fractured tear in reality. The Emperor stepped forward, reaching out with both gauntleted hands to grasp the heavy metal rims of the pods. The intense kinetic radiation of the warp burned the golden auramite from his gauntlets, exposing the bare metal beneath. He managed to secure a physical grip on several of the pods, pulling backward with the full mechanical torque of his power armor. The ruinous powers surged, flooding the cavern with blinding violet light and deafening acoustic feedback. The sheer kinetic force of the blast threw the Emperor backward across the room, smashing him through the heavy iron command table. The 20 stasis pods vanished into the churning plasma. The fractured tear in reality collapsed inward, sealing the boundary between the immaterium and real space with a concussive snap. The heavy silence returned to the cavern, broken only by the hiss of severed coolant lines and the dripping of synthetic amniotic fluid from the broken supply tubes. The Emperor pushed himself up from the ruined metal table. He looked at the empty space where the stasis pods had stood, calculating the random trajectories the warp currents would carry the developing Primarchs. He registered the loss of his commanders, yet he immediately adjusted his strategic timetable. He turned away from the empty chamber, walking back toward the heavy transit elevator, preparing to lead the Great Crusade with the raw Space Marine legions until he could locate the scattered coordinates of his lost sons across the galaxy. The biological specimens scattered across the galaxy inside their damaged stasis pods. The churning currents of the warp propelled the iron-framed armor-glass tubes through the dimensional fabric, bypassing thousands of light-years of physical space in minutes. The Emperor remained seated on the golden throne, deep beneath the Himalaysian palace. He closed his eyes and expanded his psychic awareness into the void, searching for the bioelectric signatures of his lost creations. He detected 20 distinct signals burning like bright golden stars across the galaxy. The pods had crashed onto the surfaces of widely dispersed terrestrial planets, embedded in isolated human civilizations. He calculated the exact galactic coordinates of each signal, logging the data into the heavy brass chronometers attached to his command throne. He initiated a massive military mobilization across Terra and Mars. Millions of Imperial Army soldiers marched up the boarding ramps of heavy transport shuttles. Thousands of fully armored space marines locked themselves into the drop pods of the massive void ships constructed in the lunar shipyards. The Fabricator General of Mars deployed entire legions of towering Titan war machines, loading the heavy bipedal constructs into specialized, heavily shielded cargo haulers. The Emperor finalized the strategic vectors for the Great Crusade. He stepped down from the Golden Throne, leaving the automated psychic resonators to hold the webway portal open. He walked through the subterranean vaults, his heavy auramite boots striking the metal grating, and ascended to the orbital landing pads. He boarded his Golden Command ship, directing the massive, combined armada of Terra and Mars to ignite their plasma drives and break out into the unknown regions of the galaxy. The massive fleet dropped out of the warp above a desolate, arid planet designated Chthoniya. The planetary surface consisted of deep, excavated strip mines and massive, hollowed-out tunnel networks. The local human population lived inside these lightless subterranean shafts, forming violent, heavily tattooed gang clans that warred continuously for control of the remaining mineral veins. The Emperor's Golden Command ship descended into the largest central mining pit, crushing the rusted mining equipment beneath its landing struts. He deployed the Lunar Wolves directly into the tunnels. The grey-armored space marines advanced with perfectly synchronized bolter fire, shattering the crude defensive barricades and exterminating the gang leaders with concentrated thermal blasts from their Volkite chargers. The Space Marines secured the central command cavern of the largest gang syndicate. The Emperor walked down the boarding ramp of his shuttle and entered the cavern. He found a young man standing at the center of the room, surrounded by the charred remains of the local gang fighters. The young man possessed dense, hyper-developed musculature and stood taller than the surrounding space marines. He wore rough animal hides and held a heavy, blood-stained steel blade. The Emperor recognized the exact biological markers and the bright psychic aura radiating from the young man. He had located Horus, the first of his lost Primarchs. He did not raise his weapon. He extended his gauntleted hand, physically offering the young warrior immediate command over the thousands of grey-armored space marines standing in the cavern. Horus looked at the towering, golden-armored figure, dropped his crude steel blade onto the stone floor, and accepted the position, binding the vicious gang culture of Chthoniya directly into the military structure of the newly designated Sons of Horus Legion. Over the next 2 centuries, the Imperial Armada crossed the galaxy, locating the remaining scattered stasis pods. The fleet broke orbit above the heavy-gravity death world of Medusa. The planet featured high-density atmospheric toxins and towering, jagged mountain peaks permanently shrouded in thick black smog. The Emperor discovered Mortarion, leading an army of bio-augmented human rebels against the ruling class of necromantic warlords. Mortarion wore a heavy rebreather mask to filter the toxic air, carrying a massive, motorized combat scythe. The Emperor integrated Mortarion's resilient, heavily scarred rebel infantry directly into the Death Guard Legion, providing them with heavy ceramite armor and specialized chemical warfare munitions. The fleet pushed further into the void, translating back into real space above the ice-locked world of Fenris. The planetary surface consisted of shifting, grinding tectonic plates covered in miles of solid blue ice. Violent thermal geysers regularly shattered the ice shelves, sending boiling water exploding into the freezing atmosphere. The local human tribes wrapped themselves in the thick pelts of massive, genetically altered wolves, fighting for survival against the harsh environment and predatory megafauna. The Emperor walked out onto the frozen oceans and found Leman Russ, a massive warrior draped in wolf skins and flanked by two heavily muscled Fenrisian wolves. The Emperor challenged Russ to a physical duel, testing the genetic limits of his creation. After hours of brutal kinetic impacts that cracked the surrounding ice shelves, the Emperor struck Russ down with a heavy blow from his power gauntlet, forcing the feral warrior to submit and assume command of the Space Wolves Legion. The Emperor traveled to the civilized, culturally advanced world of Macragge, a planet featuring towering marble cities and highly organized, disciplined military academies. He located Reboot Gilliman, governing the entire planetary system, having utilized his hyper-cognitive processing speed to establish a perfect, unbreakable logistical and economic infrastructure. The Emperor integrated Gilliman's massive, well-supplied mortal armies and advanced tactical doctrines directly into the Ultramarines Legion, establishing Macragge as a permanent secondary staging ground for the Great Crusade. The Golden Command ship broke through the heavy orbital smog layers of the industrial forge world of Inuit. The Emperor found Rogel Dawn commanding a massive star-spanning empire from a mobile, heavily fortified void station known as the Phalanx. Dawn wore solid gold power armor and carried a massive revving chain blade. He immediately recognized the Emperor's supreme authority, surrendering control of his vast industrial empire and accepting command of the Imperial Fists Legion, integrating their expertise in siege warfare and defensive fortification construction into the core strategies of the Crusade. One by one, the Emperor located the 20 scattered biological specimens. He pulled them from the radioactive wastelands, the towering hive cities, and the frozen death worlds. He equipped them with specialized, custom-forged power armor and massive, unique combat weapons tailored to their specific biological strengths. He placed them at the head of the 20 Space Marine legions, directing them to lead massive expeditionary fleets outward across the galaxy. He remained at the center of the crusade, calculating the logistical requirements, adjusting the planetary assault vectors, and watching the borders of his unified human empire expand across the stars, securing the resources and the territory necessary to ensure the permanent survival of the human species. The Emperor sat at a heavy iron desk inside his golden command ship, dipping a metal stylus into a well of black ink. He dragged the sharp point across thick sheets of cured parchment, writing the strict physical laws of the imperial truth. He documented the biological nature of the human species, rejecting supernatural phenomena and enforcing the study of empirical science. He ordered the physical destruction of all religious texts, holy icons, and places of worship across the newly conquered human colonies. Heavy transport shuttles descended into the atmospheres of thousands of compliant worlds, carrying cadres of iterator scribes and squads of space marines. These forces marched into the stone temples and grand cathedrals, dragging wooden pews, woven tapestries, and marble statues out into the central public squares. The Space Marines piled leather-bound books and brass chalices into towering mounds. They poured refined promethium over the gathered artifacts and ignited the piles with thermal blasts from their Volkite weapons. Thick columns of black smoke rose into the planetary atmospheres as the physical representations of faith burned to white ash. The Emperor mandated the integration of logic engines, the expansion of biomechanical research, and the erection of fortified infrastructure. He intended to starve the predatory entities residing within the immaterium by severing their supply of bioelectric emotional energy. On the terrestrial world of Kur, the 17th Legion enacted opposing directives. The Word-Bearers Legion constructed a massive, sprawling metropolis designated as Monarchia. The Space Marines and local human laborers quarried thousands of tons of white marble, stacking the smooth blocks to form towering cathedrals and wide, sweeping colonnades. They coated the domed roofs in hammered gold leaf and laid polished lapis lazuli across the pedestrian walkways. High priests wearing heavy velvet robes walked through the streets, swinging brass censers filled with burning incense. The priests directed the local populations to kneel before massive granite statues depicting the emperor, chanting rhythmic vocalizations, praising him as a supernatural deity. The word-bearers marched alongside the civilian processions, their crimson power armor decorated with meticulously scribed verses of religious scripture. The golden command ship dropped out of the warp currents, breaking into the upper atmosphere of Kur. The Emperor stood on the primary observation deck, looking down through the thick armor-glass windows at the glowing golden domes of Monarchia. He accessed the logistical data streams scrolling across his brass chronotors. The screens displayed empty foundry plots and barren industrial zones, highlighting the delayed production of munitions and promethium fuel. The 17th Legion had dedicated their labor forces to building stone temples, bypassing the quotas for mass-producing bolt shells and heavy armor plating. The Emperor opened a direct Vox channel to the Macragge Expeditionary Fleet, holding position in the adjacent sector. He ordered Robert de Guillemot and the Ultramarines Legion to execute an immediate, comprehensive demolition of the city. Within hours, hundreds of blue-armored Space Marines descended onto the marble streets of Monarchia. The Ultramarines marched in locked-step formations, gripping their bolter rifles across their chest plates. They transmitted high-decibel acoustic warnings through the public address networks, ordering the civilian population to evacuate the city limits. The heavy boots of the Ultramarines cracked the lapis lazuli walkways as they physically pushed the crowds of chanting priests and citizens out into the surrounding dust plains. The citizens stumbled over the loose rocks, coughing as the dry wind blew sand against their faces. Once the biological sensors confirmed the evacuation of all citizens, the Ultramarines returned to their heavy transport shuttles and broke orbit. The Imperial void ships positioned themselves directly over the capital. The gunnery crews loaded massive, dense-core artillery shells into the orbital macro cannons and pulled the heavy firing levers. The artillery shells tore through the atmosphere, striking the golden domes of the cathedrals. The kinetic impacts vaporized the gold leaf and shattered the white marble blocks into fine white powder. The towering colonnades snapped at their bases, crashing down onto the stone streets and crushing the granite statues of the Emperor into jagged gravel. Continuous orbital bombardments pummeled the city for 6 consecutive days. The intense friction generated by the falling munitions ignited the surrounding oxygen, turning the entire metropolitan area into a massive, contained firestorm. When the void ships ceased their barrage, Monarchia existed only as a deep, blackened crater filled with fused glass and glowing slag. The heavy transport vessels of the 17th Legion arrived in orbit shortly after the bombardment ended. Lorgar and his word-bearers deployed directly into the center of the smoking crater. The grey ash settled over their crimson armor as they stared at the pulverized remains of their architectural achievements. The Golden Command ship descended from the cloud layer, landing its heavy iron struts directly into the fused glass. The Emperor walked down the boarding ramp, flanked by Malcador the Sigillite and the towering custodian guard. He projected his golden psychic aura outward with immense, concentrated kinetic force. The sheer pressure of his mind struck the word-bearers, locking their mechanical armor joints and forcing their biological frames downward. Over 100,000 space marines and their commanding Primarch crashed to their knees in the ash, their ceramite plates grinding against the shattered marble. The Emperor stood over Lorgar, transmitting his voice through the vox amplifiers of the Legion. He transmitted the exact factory quotas they had missed, displaying the physical blueprints of the unbuilt munitions plants and the theological altars they had erected. He ordered them to cast their holy texts into the fire and accelerate their planetary bombardments to match the rapid deployment schedules of the other legions. He turned away from the kneeling warriors, walking back up the ramp of his command ship. He left the 17th Legion in the ashes of their ruined city. He returned to his navigation console, directing his fleet toward the volcanic world of Nicaea to judge the dangerous psychic mutations emerging within the biological frameworks of his remaining sons. The atmosphere of the planet Nicaea smelled heavily of sulfur and cooling basalt. A massive, natural amphitheater formed from jagged black obsidian sat inside the crater of a dormant volcano. Tiered stone seating descended hundreds of feet down the sloped caldera, curving around a central flat stage of polished basalt. Millions of space marines, iterators, planetary governors, and mechanicum priests filled the tiered seating, standing shoulder to shoulder. Several Primarchs occupied heavy iron viewing boxes, projecting outward from the crater walls. Magnus the Red, commander of the Death Guard, leaned against the iron railing, breathing through his heavy filtration mask. Sanguinius stood with his white wings folded tightly against his golden armor. Leman Russ paced across the stone floor of his box, the heavy wolf pelts draped over his shoulders, brushing against the iron grating. At the center of the polished basalt stage stood Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns. He wore deep crimson armor, layered with gold script, holding a long staff topped with a mechanical scarab. Surrounding him stood his honor guard, the Sekhmet. These warriors displayed active psychic mutations. Their eyes glowed with unnatural blue light, and purple static arced continuously across their ceramite shoulder plates. The Emperor sat upon a heavy golden throne, positioned at the absolute center of the amphitheater, directly facing Magnus. The golden light radiating from his armor illuminated the black rock beneath his feet. The Emperor listened as the gathering debated the nature of the Librarius, the integrated cadres of psychic space marines utilized by several legions. Mortarion and Leman Russ spoke into the brass vox amplifiers, demanding the immediate cessation of all psychic practices within the Space Marine legions. They pointed to the heavy collateral damage and the unpredictable warp anomalies generated during combat by the librarians. Magnus raised his staff, sending a concentrated beam of psychic energy directly into the air above the stage. The energy expanded into a massive, three-dimensional illusion, displaying complex mathematical equations and structural schematics for advanced warp conduits. He argued that the immaterium functioned as a natural extension of physical science, requiring deep study and active exploitation to secure the absolute dominance of the human empire. The Emperor stood up from his golden throne, his heavy boots striking the polished stone. He projected his golden aura outward, instantly dissipating Magnus's massive psychic illusion into a scattering of blue sparks. He raised his hand, silencing the millions of gathered humans through the sheer physical pressure of his psychic resonance. He delivered his absolute judgment through the heavy brass vox amplifiers. He dictated the Edict of Nicaea. He permanently disbanded the Librarius within every Space Marine Legion, ordering all psychic warriors to return to the standard infantry ranks and permanently cease the use of their mutations in combat. He strictly forbade the study of sorcery and the exploration of the warp beyond the authorized parameters of the navigators and astropaths. Magnus gripped his staff tightly, the metal handle groaning under the pressure. The blue light in his eyes flared, reflecting his internal resistance to the command. The Emperor turned his optical focus directly onto the Crimson King, reinforcing the edict with a blunt, absolute warning regarding the consequences of disobedience. The Emperor then ordered the assembly to disperse. He returned to his command shuttle, leaving the Primarchs to process the absolute restriction placed upon their tactical doctrines. The fleet broke orbit, scattering the expeditionary forces back across the galaxy. The Emperor set his navigation coordinates for Terra, descending back to the Himalaysian palace and re-entering the deep subterranean vaults, completely ignorant of the catastrophic chain of events his decision had set into motion. Deep within the webway, the Emperor resumed his position upon the Golden Throne. He pushed massive surges of bioelectric energy through the crystalline conduits, physically holding the dimensional tear open while the Mechanicum servitors labored to construct the adamantium causeways. Months passed in absolute silence, interrupted only by the heavy grinding of tracked servitors and the hiss of plasma torches. Then, the automated tactical monitors ringing the chamber flashed red. The heavy brass augers detected a massive, unauthorized psychic projection tearing through the outer defenses of the solar system. The projection moved with immense speed, bypassing the orbital defense grids of Luna and Terra entirely. The psychic projection crashed directly through the physical shielding of the Himalaysian palace, plunging straight down into the subterranean vault. A massive spectral figure composed of red psychic energy materialized directly in front of the Golden Throne. The figure bore the exact physical dimensions and features of Magnus the Red. The spectral projection yelled into the silent chamber, attempting to deliver a dire warning regarding the War Master Horus and the corruption of the ruinous powers. The violent materialization of the spectral figure sent a massive, uncontrolled shockwave of raw warp energy directly into the webway portal. The carefully constructed adamantium causeways shattered instantly. The physical walls, separating the webway from the surrounding immaterium, cracked and splintered. The Emperor watched the heavy metal slabs tear apart, exposing the tunnels to the violent, predatory currents of the warp. Trillions of demonic entities, previously held back by the psychic warding, flooded through the breaches, swarming into the human-built causeways and racing directly toward the open portal leading into the Imperial Palace. The Emperor gripped the iron armrests of the Golden Throne, his jaw locking tight. The heavy brass machinery around him glowed white-hot as he pushed his psychic output to absolute maximum capacity. He extended his golden kinetic shield directly across the dimensional tear, physically blocking the horde of demonic entities from spilling into the vault. The immense physical strain caused blood to pool in the corners of his eyes and leak from his ears. He realized the sheer volume of the demonic incursion required his permanent, continuous psychic focus to hold the breach. He could not leave the Golden Throne, trapping himself in the deep earth while the galaxy above him burned. Heavy orbital macro cannons tore through the thick atmospheric smog of Istvan III. The mass-reactive shells struck the central planetary capital, detonating against the heavy ferrocrete domes and shattering the glass transit tubes connecting the high spires. The viral bombardment followed immediately after. Thousands of specialized glass canisters dropped from the void, bursting upon impact with the ground. The canisters released the Life-Eater virus, a highly volatile biological agent engineered to consume organic matter. The heavy green gas expanded rapidly across the city streets, seeping into the residential block ventilation systems. The civilian population collapsed onto the ferrocrete walkways, their flesh melting into a dark liquid sludge within seconds as the virus completely dissolved their cellular structure. The virus multiplied exponentially, consuming every living organism on the planet's surface and releasing massive quantities of highly flammable biogases into the atmosphere. The War Master Horus stood on the observation deck of his command ship, watching the green clouds cover the entire continent. He issued a single command to the gunnery crews. A single lance of concentrated orbital laser fire struck the atmosphere, instantly igniting the accumulated biogases. A planet-wide firestorm engulfed Istvan III, incinerating the biological sludge and turning the surface into a completely sterile, scorched wasteland of black ash. Horus utilized this planetary extermination to purge his own ranks. He had deployed the Space Marines within the Sons of Horus, Emperor's children, World Eaters, and Death Guard legions who remained strictly loyal to the Emperor directly into the capital city before the bombardment. He intended to eliminate all internal resistance to his newly declared rebellion. However, thousands of loyalist Space Marines survived the initial viral strike by sealing themselves inside deep, airtight subterranean bunkers and activating their heavy power armor environmental seals. As the firestorm died down, the surviving loyalists breached the surface. They gripped their bolters and formed tight defensive perimeters amid the ruined, blackened ferrocrete walls. They recognized the betrayal and prepared to hold the ruined city against their own commanders. Horus observed the surviving thermal signatures on his tactical augers. He deployed his remaining corrupted Space Marine legions directly into the ashes of Istvan III to exterminate the Loyalists in brutal, close-quarters urban combat. The resulting slaughter dragged on for weeks, forcing Horus to expend massive amounts of ammunition and manpower to clear the ruins. Following the clearance of Istvan III, Horus established a massive, heavily fortified staging ground on the neighboring planet of Istvan IV. He directed the Mechanicum adepts allied with his rebellion to construct deep trench networks, heavy anti-orbital defense batteries, and reinforced ceramite bunkers across the black sand plains of the Urgal Depression. The Emperor, permanently locked to the Golden Throne on Terra, received the fragmented astropathic transmissions detailing the betrayal. The intense psychic strain of holding the webway portal open caused blood to leak continuously from his nose and eyes. He directed his loyal commanders to mobilize a massive retribution fleet. He ordered 7 complete Space Marine legions to deploy to the Istvan system, execute the War Master, and crush the rebellion entirely. The massive Imperial Retribution Fleet exited the warp above Istvan V. The Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamander's legions formed the first wave of the assault. Thousands of heavy transport drop pods launched from the void ships, slamming directly into the black sand of the Urgal Depression. The Space Marines charged out of the craters, firing their bolters at the fortified trench networks held by Horus's forces. The Loyalist legions took heavy casualties from the concentrated artillery fire, their ceramite armor cracking under the continuous barrage of plasma and heavy ordnance. They pushed forward relentlessly, clearing the first lines of trenches with revving chainswords and concentrated melter blasts. The second wave of the Imperial Retribution Fleet deployed to the planet's surface. The Word-Bearers, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and Alpha Legion landed their massive transport shuttles directly behind the advancing lines of the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders. The first wave legions pulled back slightly to regroup and resupply with the newly arrived reinforcements. As the Loyalist forces turned to face the second wave, the newly arrived legions raised their weapons. They did not fire at Horus's trenches. They turned their bolters, heavy plasma cannons, and autocannons directly onto the exhausted, damaged ranks of the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders. The second wave had already sworn their loyalty to Horus. The coordinated, point-blank crossfire annihilated the Loyalist ranks. The explosive mass-reactive shells ripped through the backs of the unsuspecting Space Marines, turning the black sand of the Urgol Depression into a massive, organized execution ground. Horus utilized this calculated ambush to shatter the primary military strength of the Emperor's Retribution fleet, clearing the physical path for his massive armada to march directly on the Sol system. Thousands of heavily armored void ships entered the perimeter of the Sol system, their plasma drives burning red against the black vacuum of space. The armada bypassed the ruined lunar defense stations and established a low orbit directly over Terra. Horus directed the gunnery crews of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, to lower their massive macro cannons. Millions of artillery shells struck the outer ferrocrete walls of the Himalaysian palace. The defensive lasers of the Imperial Palace fired back, sending thick beams of red thermal energy upward to slice through the iron hulls of the traitor fleet. Molten metal rained down onto the Himalayan peaks, setting the remaining atmospheric oxygen on fire. Inside the subterranean vault, the Emperor sat upon the golden throne. The constant psychic strain of holding the webway portal shut caused his muscle tissue to atrophy. His skin clung tightly to his collarbones, and his lips cracked from severe dehydration. The orbital bombardment above fractured the stone ceiling of the cavern, dropping heavy chunks of granite onto the metal decking. The Emperor pulled the heavy neural shunts from the connection ports at the base of his skull. Malkador the Sigillite stepped forward, taking the Emperor's position on the brass seat and pushing his own bioelectric energy into the crystalline conduits. The Emperor gripped his power sword, the blue kinetic field sparking against the stone floor. He activated a localized teleportation array, converting his physical mass into a beam of concentrated light and transmitting his structure directly onto the command deck of the Vengeful Spirit. The Emperor materialized on the metal grating of the flagship. Horus stood before him, his pale gray armor swollen and warped by the continuous influx of warp plasma. Thick, jagged bone spurs protruded through the ceramite plates, and heavy black veins pumped raw kinetic energy across his exposed neck. Horus swung a massive power mace, striking the Emperor's golden breastplate. The heavy impact shattered the auramite, driving jagged shards of metal directly into the Emperor's lungs and ribcage. The Emperor stumbled backward, blood pouring from his mouth and coating the iron floor. Horus raised a bladed talon, tearing through the Emperor's right arm and severing the brachial artery. The Emperor dropped his power sword onto the grating. He looked at the mutated, swollen biological structure of his former commander. The Emperor focused his remaining bioelectric capacity, gathering the entire mass of his golden psychic aura and compressing it into a single, blinding spear of kinetic force. He projected this energy directly into Horus's chest. The kinetic blast struck the War Master, instantly evaporating the ceramite armor and vaporizing the underlying cellular structure. The massive influx of psychic heat severed the connection between Horus and the ruinous powers, turning his physical form into a cloud of drifting gray ash. The atmospheric pressure inside the command deck equalized, and the heavy red emergency lights flickered over the empty space where Horus had stood. Rogel Dawn teleported onto the command deck minutes later. He found the Emperor lying in a pool of his own clotting blood, his collarbone crushed, and his respiratory system failing. Dawn lifted the shattered biological frame of the Emperor, carrying him back to the teleportation array and transmitting them both down into the deep subterranean vault of the Himalaysian palace. Inside the cavern, Malkador's physical body had crumbled into a pile of grey dust upon the brass seat, his cellular structure completely consumed by the massive power output of the Golden Throne. Rogel Dawn laid the Emperor onto the heavy mechanical seat. Mechanicum servitors rushed forward, driving thick copper cables directly into the Emperor's spinal column and fusing heavy life support shunts into his remaining organic tissue. They welded heavy bronze plates over his shattered chest cavity and activated the localized stasis fields, locking his biological decay in a state of permanent suspension. The heavy adamantium blast doors of the vault slid shut, sealing the chamber from the atmospheric ash of the ruined world above. The Emperor remained seated on the Golden Throne, his physical body sustained by the constant hum of the geothermal turbines and the continuous injection of chemical preservatives. His mind projected outward, casting a blinding golden beam into the churning plasma currents of the immaterium. The transmission pierced the kinetic radiation of the warp, giving the navigators of the surviving human void ships a fixed point of reference to steer their vessels across the galaxy. The mechanical pumps circulated synthetic amniotic fluid through his locked veins, holding his biological structure upon the brass seat as the planetary rotations continued.